Alrighty, welcome back to the Defying Gravity podcast with Zach Goodman. Today I have on a special guest, Michael Fahey. You might know him from Westside vs. the World, or maybe as a strength and speed coach at Florida High, or maybe more recently you know him as the creator or owner of OVR Sports Performance. Okay, Michael has his hands in a lot of different things, and he's pretty well connected and experienced in this field. So I'm pretty excited to have him on. Me and Michael have known each other for a few years now, and probably talk a few times a week on training. And he's someone that I've stolen a lot of things from, and have ran a lot of ideas by. And he's someone that I have in my corner to kind of help guide me in my own coaching journey. And so we're going to kind of talk about that a bit today. Michael, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. Just got back from training, doing some of our summer workouts. Um, I feel good any day. Basically, I'm able to get in the gym, and especially uh, when I have a moment to decompress, sort of before my wife and kids come home. I've got a 19-month-old, so uh, yeah, I got a lot of things going on.
And I appreciate you coming on this podcast. I know we'll probably sit here and talk for a bit. So I appreciate you taking some time out of your busy day. I know you got a lot of things going on with the businesses and training kids and all the stuff you got going on. So I do appreciate that.
No
Uh,
problem.
so the first thing I want to talk to you about is you've been pretty successful at both schools you've been at. You've been at Leon, you've been at Florida High, and you've had a lot of success at both of those places. And something that I think a lot of coaches maybe haven't heard a lot about, or they don't really know where to start, is when you first get to a new school and you get those new teams coming in. What are the first things that you do with those teams, either to build buy-in, training wise? Like, where do you start at? You get a new team to come in, you're at a new school. Where do you start?
Um, the the first thing that I start with is to try and hopefully have a conversation with the coach. Right now I work with 7 or 8 different sports. But I started off at the old school with just football. And we stayed just football. I had kids who, played a lot of other sports, but in an official capacity, I only worked with the football team. Now I have almost the opposite setup where I work with basically like everybody else. But that started off with a conversation with a wrestling coach. They were the first team to get on my schedule and start off with me. And so the very first thing that I did was I sat down with them and just kind of said, like, hey, in broad strokes, this is what I do. I track everything. Um, I only care about the kids getting better. And the very first thing that I stressed to them was like, I am a performance coach. I'm not a babysitter. Um, I have a pretty incredible amount of patience, I think. I'm very good with the kids, and I don't mind being around the kids. I don't mind having large numbers or having, I've had elementary schoolers and stuff there before. I don't mind any of that. But that being said, whether you are, 10 years old or 18 years old, if you're coming to work out with me, like we're doing it to get you actively better. So the first thing is I kind of lay out like I am a huge believer in the idea that like this kind of stuff matters. I can map out for you like how I do what I do and what I expect for it to do. And I can kind of tell you like beat by beat how we're gonna on ramp it and stuff. But the first thing is just like, I talk to the coaches about like what is it that you want, and the secret is like every coach wants athletes who are going to help them win. Every coach wants athletes who are going to be a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, a little bit faster than their predecessors. And so trying to sort of outline to them with, say, my wrestling coach, who is like a really good friend now. He was, as I said, the first coach at this new school to buy in. And he is, hook, line, and sinker down with everything that we do. But the very first meeting that we had, he said, like, well, I don't really care what you do so long as they power clean. And I immediately proceeded to like get up and say, I don't know if this is actually a good fit. And he was very like taken aback by how quickly I was to just sort of move on and say, okay, I'm going to go about my day then. Um, and so he stopped me and said, whoa, what do we like? What are the options here? And I said, well, why do you want them to power clean? He said, triple extension. And I said, have you actually ever watched your kids to see if they're getting triple extension? This is not, by the way, a technique that I would recommend to anyone in terms of like an initial interview and stuff. Especially if you're a younger coach or don't have a track record, or you don't have, I have an X factor sort of in the bag that, the media work and other things that I've done. So I can point to sort of credibility in other places. But the real point of it was I want the coach to kind of state what they want. Because if you state what you want, I can tell you how I give it to you. So he said, well, I want my athletes to be more explosive. I said, great. The most explosive thing that you can do, explosive strength is the steepest increase in force in the shortest amount of time. So by definition, the most explosive thing we can do is jump. So in fact, if your power cleans are working, then your athletes are going to jump higher. So all I'm going to do is basically cut out that middle, and we're not going to spend our time on the power cleans. Instead, we're going to do things that would, if we power cleaned, would improve our power clean. We're just going to take out that middle portion, and we're going to do the stuff that makes us stronger and the stuff that makes us faster. And we're not going to worry about this middle section because, no one gets paid in that middle. You get paid typically on the faster, more explosive end, and the only way that you get there is by improving on that slower end. In the end, or in the middle, there's sort of an adaptational dead zone. So we're going to do very little training in that zone. We're going to be on the right or the left of it. And I told them your kids are going to jump freakishly high. They're going to be much faster than you're used to. And I said, what else do you want? And it was basically, well, I have some kids that I need to get bigger over time. I said, I'm, not to brag, but I'm north of 280 pounds and I know how to eat. I know how you get big. That part's not hard either. And even with all that, in both instances at both schools, the main thing that I think I initially communicated to them was like, I'm incredibly passionate about this, and I can talk about this in a detail that you probably can't, and you probably don't actually want to. And then probably most importantly, I can hold my own when you put me out there with the kids. Like, your kids are going to love me. I am this passionate with the kids, and your kids are going to have a higher appetite for this kind of talk, honestly, than you are. And that's sort of the other thing is that, that first day with the kids like at their nature, just biologically, they want to learn. They want every piece of they want more information than you can typically give them. There's this idea that because kids are young and they are relatively simple, that they don't want to learn, which is antithetical to the entire human experience. Kids are young and essentially dumb because they're kids, and what makes them adults is that they learn. The whole experience of life, you're just taking in massive sums of information. So the first day that I'm there, the coaches, they can't keep up with what I'm saying, but they can tell, okay, he's really into this. And at minimum, I'm going to allow them, I allowed my wrestling coach to split up his practices because we're a K through 12 school. So me having the kids in the weight room meant that he was then free to go run a second practice with the younger kids. So initially, I don't think he was really bought into what I was doing. I think he was bought into the idea of, well, now I have more support, So at worst, this guy allows me to spread myself further. And then over time, it was, that I could show him, hey, look at these numbers, hey, look, this kid's up 4 inches already on his vertical. And he would come in and watch them and, like, yeah, I didn't think he could jump that high, and he didn't care what the numbers said on at that time we were using a just jump mat, but he didn't care what those numbers said. He cared that he was looking and he was like, that looks borderline strange to see that kid, because I've known that kid and I've seen that kid move for years, to see him now jump noticeably higher and go, well, it's only been like a month. It's been like 6 weeks, like what, then all of a sudden he's asking me, so how does this typically work? Like, how far will that kid go? Is this, are all the kids going to do this? And then he started to get curious about how everything worked. Um, and then suddenly I started getting phone calls from some of the other coaches. The volleyball coach was next. And then the girls soccer coach was next. And, just kept snowballing like that. And the very first thing that everyone wanted to know was like, I think the first thing that you have to communicate if you're in that sort of school setting is like, especially for someone like me who has kind of like manic energy around what I'm into, that energy is going to be consistent. I am, like I'm bulldozing through this right now. I'm not even allowing you to talk. I have that energy 24/7, 365. I'm always that excited. So you're not catching me on like a weird emotional swing where I'm real into it and then in a couple weeks I'm going to be checked out of it. I'm going to be this all the time, and then I'm going to get along well with your kids because, number one, your kids, again, by nature, they have questions. They are just dying to learn things, and they're dying to learn anything that's going to help them in pursuit of their goal. And this is where, like, I think that a lot of sport coaches often get kind of fouled up is, you know, they look at a lot of times at questions as derailing their practice or derailing, their lesson. Um, Granted, I'm in the weight room, so like we're dealing with huge periods of downtime, say in between sets, or it's a much more sort of, it's a very chaotic environment, but there's a lot of room for a kid to come up and have a short conversation with me. And we can do the conversation in parts, or they can stay after, but any question a kid has for me, I have the answer. And the kids really quickly respond to that. And they go test your answers like immediately. So I've got to, you miss a bench and I can come by and say, like, hey, bring it down faster. Like, you have to really attack it. Try and speed off the chest, bring it down faster. It's going to stall. What we're trying to do is get that stalling point half an inch higher, get your elbow up under it. And now all of a sudden you can fight through it. But, how long have you been taking in between sets? Add a minute to that and come back. You're going to smoke it. Then we're going to go up another jump. Like, I can tell them their next like 8 minutes of existence, and it's going to play out exactly how I told them. And so now you take a kid who was just guessing and they were just kind of hoping things would work out for them and they had no plan. And then you gave them a short, very simple plan. And all of a sudden, like, you earned a ton of trust. And they see that, like, oh, this guy doesn't get upset when I have questions. He invites me to talk. He wants input from me. Um, and then he provided me with an answer that got me to that next, I got them a 5 or 10 pound PR like immediately. And it's not because my program was amazing. The program had no time yet. They had no clue what they were doing and no one had ever stopped to help them out. So they weren't even aware of how bad they were at it. You know, like, there's just so much open space. So real quickly you develop a rapport, and again, the kids just want answers. And I've been doing this long enough that, like, even with kids who were, quote unquote, like difficult, I had a conversation with a scout not long ago where we were talking about one kid who, um, Louis would always say, like, as say like Chuck Vogelpool got stronger. This is in the movie. but like as Chuck or Matt Dimmel or his premier athletes, as they would get stronger, they would be harder and harder to deal with. And it was because you had to outpace them, right? So like he's working with the strongest people in the world and they're stronger than him already. And they want they're going to places where only one or two people have ever been, or no one has ever been, in the case of, say, like Dave Hoff. And now they've got questions that like Louis Simmons had never answered, and they have no patience if he doesn't have the answer.
Right.
So they become more challenging in, like when an athlete starts to outgrow you, and it's your best athletes that will do that. But at the high school level, I'm like, until y'all are like 28, like y'all are going to be someone else's headache by the time you get to a point where you can really outpace me.
Right.
And the whole way, I'm going to be learning new problems it's part of having so many kids. I get, um, I looked at my program right now. I had like 290 something athletes last year. I've got like 147 right now who have done our summer program.
Yeah.
Um, so I see so many versions of every problem, and real quickly you spot patterns, and well, this kid's just where that kid was 6 months ago, and that kid's where he'll be in 18 months, and like, so that to the kid it's a new thing, but to you it's just the same kid kind of recycling through in a different body.
Yeah, no doubt. Like, especially like you said, when you have that experience and you've seen the same exact problem happen over and over and over. And then when you give them the correct answer, and like you said, they're gonna try and test it right away. I think it also says a lot about like you as a coach or a person that these kids feel comfortable talking to you. Because like you said, many coaches and adults get defensive, especially about things they don't
Mhm.
know. And so what you see
Yeah.
pretty quickly is when they do ask you questions and you give them that correct answer, they do buy in pretty quickly. And I know that you've talked to me about having kids jump on the jump mat for you, and you tweak a few things. You have them do your protocol on the belt marches, and they jump exactly what they say you're going to jump. And I know some other really good coaches can almost tell you exactly what a kid's going to do based on a certain protocol or a certain thing they're seeing. So it takes experience to kind of have that keen eye. And you've been around, obviously. You were at West Side, and you've seen some of the strongest people on the planet over there, and you've been around tons of really good athletes. I know you trained the state record holder in the long jump, right? It's the long jump at Leon.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
He was big.
you've dealt with some of the highest level athletes in high school already. Um,
Mhm.
so something I have a question on regarding the jumps. Could you lay out that burn the ladders kind of jump protocol? I know that we've talked about it before, but many people maybe don't know about the burn the ladders jump protocol. I've had a lot of success with
Mhm.
it. I've stolen a lot of your jump stuff. So can you tell me how that's kind of evolved and kind of give me the rundown of what that looks like maybe right now?
Yeah. A lot of it is a combination of stealing from Jared Bidney and Brandon Bird, with of course some sort of like modifications based on things I saw at West Side with Louis. Um, so at West Side, Louis would have a lot of athletes come by, but they didn't. The athletes often did not stay very long. Um, so they'd come visit, and you'd kind of see like him theoretically explaining a bunch of things over and over and over again. And then he kind of showcased a few things like with box jumps and stuff, but you wouldn't get to see this real progression and arc of development. Um, and then Louis put me on to Brandon Bird and Jared Bidney, probably around 2015, 2016, late 2015, early 2016. And he told me about how Jared had all these kids doing these crazy dumbbell jumps. So I started following Jared, and Bird had kids doing outrageous box jumps at the time. And Westside didn't have much in the way of technology back then. So it was mostly box jumps that they did. That's what they had historically done. They had a broad jump mat, just a rubber one that went out to like 10 feet. Um, and, it was a very hard rubber with, just on polished concrete. And it was not a pleasant experience to like land on it. Um, and then most of their athletes, they had some fighters and stuff, in the movie, like AJ Dobson, who has made his way up to the UFC for a few matches. He jumped like 61.5 inches with a walk up. Um, but they didn't have they had some track athletes and stuff, but they all seemed like kind of 1 foot in, and we're still having to do so much stuff with like Ohio State and whatnot. Um, but so I talked just ad nauseum with Louis about like how you would do jump training and all this, but I didn't have a roster of athletes really to test this with. I didn't have a box jump set up back home. I didn't have a jump mat or anything like that. But I just started watching what Jared and Bird were doing. And then I move up to Tallahassee. I start working with the football team at Leon High School, and I got a just jump mat. I thought it would be fun, thought it would be cool. Like finally, I'd have a big selection of athletes, and um, real quickly, what happened was I had one mat, and the first week I had 8 athletes. Second week I had 12 athletes. By the fifth week, I had about 60 athletes. Then COVID happened, and we came back to school about 3 months later for summer workouts. And day one, I had like 98 athletes, and I had one jump mat. So
Yeah.
I had to figure out like, okay, when we had 8 kids, I could just say like, hey, let's all take turns, and let's each do 10 or 20 jumps. Let's do sort of the Louis protocol of pick 2 variations, and let's get 20 sort of measured jumps at both. And let's do that twice a week. And then it became, all right, you guys are in group 1, you guys are in group 2. Group 1, you're going to do this today, and group 2, you'll do it tomorrow. And we'll get our like 80 jumps over the course of the week. And then it became, there were just way too many kids. It was getting really hard to keep track of. I started to notice that the kids didn't remember their numbers. I was always a kid who remembered my numbers. But I have some neurodivergences that, make me a little more obsessive about numbers. But so I started tracking what the kids were doing. I started bringing a spreadsheet that would just have the kids' names and then their jump. And I'd put it would have their like historic, what was their best jump, and then what did they do today, and started tracking that way just in Google Sheets. And eventually I kind of ended on this plan of like, we're going to do 4 dumbbell jumps and 4 vertical jumps, 4 standing verticals. So we were doing 8 jumps, but we were doing them every single day. So they were still only getting, about 36 to 40 jumps per week. So half of what Louis was prescribing, but they were very young, very new athletes. So I figured, this probably works for their work capacity. So everything being on the just jump mat meant that everything was being measured. So the intensity was always high, the frequency was high, the volume was low. So almost like a Bulgarian type approach to the jumping. We're going to always try and max. We're always trying to break a record. We're going to do it every single day, but the volume is very low. Then eventually I got more mats. So we got up to, at one point, we had 3 mats. But again, we would have, 90 to 100 kids sometimes, and it would just be me as the coach. So then I started laying out broad jump mats and stuff so that they would, I could kind of shift kids around into different groups, but they would always have their dumbbell jump, their standing vertical, and then often a secondary jump or a throw. And we started measuring throws by like doing Powerball toss and stuff, just with a tape measure. And then from there, it became a really big thing. I started putting up a list, if you were over 30 inches at first we only had like 7 kids who were over 30 inches in the first like couple weeks. And then by the end of the first 5 weeks, I think we had 18, including a kid who had gone from 36 to 40 and another kid who had gone from 32 to 36. So I started establishing like a different tier within our list where it was, the markers were 30 inches got you on the list. At 32 inches, or 36 inches, your name would be bold. And then at 40 inches, your name would have like a gold background behind it. And so I called this the Flight Club. And I started giving out, when we got maybe 4 members in the 36-inch club, I started giving out shirts, and the shirt said Flight Club, established at 36 inches. But so this just continued, and we were having a lot of success. We probably had at that point like 6 kids in the Flight Club of 36 inches plus. 3 of them were 40-inch plus, including the long jumper, who at this time had gone from 32 inches to 40, 40.9, I think. And we were doing a lot of belted marches. The belted marches are a thing that I would see done all the time at Westside, especially with fighters. And it would be to, take this wide waddling base in march, trying to hit about 3 steps per second for usually a 1 to 2 minute battery. But sometimes the fighters would go up to like 4 or 5 minutes. But my kids were normally doing like 2 to 3 rounds of 2 minutes. And I had one kid, a freshman, who he worked really hard, and he saw some of his sort of more gifted teammates were very quickly hitting 30 inches and progressing upwards. He would outwork these kids. He'd show up every single day. He'd do every single rep that I asked him to do. Great worker, hard worker, but he was struggling to break 30 inches. So one day we're doing, this belted marching, which again, with a wide stance, we're doing it in a high school. So to do it cheaply, I got a loading pin, which cost about $20 at the time. I got a 5-foot by 2-inch nylon sling from a towing company that we would use as a belt. So it looked like one of the Spud Inc. belts, that kind of material, but it was only 2 inches thick. So it kind of hurts. It's very uncomfortable. I recommend, if you have the money, get something that's like 4 or 5 inches, because it'll spread the weight out a little bit. But basically, for under $40, I had a very poor man's ATP, or a belt squat platform. So my kids would all line up, and we had 12 of these loading pins and 12 of these straps. So we'd have, 12 kids going for 2 minutes, and then they'd swap and another kid would come in. So we'd have 3 kids on each loading pin. So you get 4 minutes off, go 2 minutes on, 4 minutes off, 2 minutes on. And finally, this one kid, he got up to 10 plates on the loading pin. So 450 pounds plus another maybe 15 pounds for the loading pin. And he came out of it after 2 minutes, and he was just super wobbly. And this kid had been stuck at 29.9 for a couple weeks. He's super wobbly, and he goes over and asks me, it's the end of the workout. Maybe like 40% of the kids have sort of quit the end of the workout by now, because we'd have these big long marathon sessions from like 1:45 in the afternoon to 5:30. So we would sprint, we'd jump. We had time for everything. It was almost like it really was almost like an after school or daycare or something, for especially the younger kids, the freshmen, sophomores who didn't have cars. But for any of those kids, especially like some of the kids who, come from lower income situations, where they had somewhere to be that was, productive and relatively chaperoned. But this one kid who, again, he's frustrated that his friends aren't trying nearly as hard and they're having more success. Genetics just work like that sometimes. But he's determined he's going to beat his friends in every single exercise, and he gets up to 10 plates on the loading pin, which is right around, I think we've had 11 plates on there before, but we had to use particular 45s that were really thin and stuff. So he's really like stretching the limits of what we can even do. And he takes it off, and he's so wobbly. He looks like he's, just come in from a voyage through like a typhoon or something out at sea. And he's so wobbly, and he says, Coach Fahey, can I go jump? I said, sure. I don't know how well you're going to jump. Like, you can barely walk. And he wobbles over, and his first jump, he can't even land back on the mat. And he just laughs. He thinks it's hilarious. But he gets kind of high. So he goes back and he jumps 31 inches, I think. And he keeps jumping, and he gets to like 32. And then he goes back and he does another round. When he stops, he starts to lose that sort of wobbly feeling. He goes back and he does another 2 minutes with the 10 plates. He comes back over, and he's still super wobbly. And I think he got up to 33.6 that day. So he went from 29.9 to 33.6 after about 6 months of training and about a month and a half of being stuck at that 29.9 number. And so he rocketed past his buddies. And so the next day I pulled 4 other kids over, and I had them do it. And I had him come back, and the very first thing he did before he was allowed to touch a single weight was he had to come back and jump, because I wanted to see, is this just regular PAP? Like, is this just a, an ephemeral, like fleeting residual effect, or can he still jump? And sure enough, he jumped like 32 or 33.2 on his very first jump the next day with literally, like, he was in street clothes, took his backpack off, walked over in like some Doc Martens, and busted off another 33.
Interesting.
So the like PAP effect this was 24 hours later, and he's still doing it.
So it allowed him
And
to
if
kind of reach that
anything,
next level.
yeah. And so then I took like 5 kids who stayed late. And the next day I was like, hey, I know it's an upper body day, but we're going to do some marches. And I had them do the same thing. They all jumped basically they all jumped PRs, and then they all jumped very close to their PR or PR'd again right off the bat the next day cold. And so, yeah, so we started doing jumps at the beginning of the workout, our 4 and 4, and then coming back and doing jumps at the end. And they would do those when we were at Leon. It was just belted marches and jump. So twice a week on our lower body days, that's how we'd finish off. Then I get to Florida High, and the weight room is really small by comparison. So now I've got to like really figure out how to space kids. And now I start having like one group of kids go do sleds at the end, and another group of kids is doing their belted marches at the end. And they're both coming over, and I started to notice, like, well, the girls, because I didn't have girls at Leon, really. I had one girl who jumped like a 31, and another girl who ran 20 point something on a fly 10. But it was literally like, I think I had 3 girls who sort of part-time trained with me. And 2 really were monstrous right off the bat.
So just a quick question on those belted marches.
Yeah.
What do you think exactly from your view? What is happening there? So they're wobbly, they're jumping higher. What are these belted marches doing for them? What are they training? And then how do you think they're kind of potentially, like, what's your theory on this? What's happening there?
So what I think is happening, and again, this was like a thing that I just observed from a
Right.
kid dicking around.
Yeah.
What I think is happening is I started to notice it happening later with sled pulls, and then I started to notice it happening even later with trap bar carries. So we would have these like sort of long duration GPP type finishers to build work capacity at the end of our workouts. On lower body days, it would be belted marches or sleds and those are just sled walks. So power walk, sled dragging behind you.
Yeah.
And then on the upper body day, it's these trap bar carries. And the marches would be in these rounds of 2 minutes. And we would go really heavy. Like how we would do it, you might have like 3 sets of 2 minutes assigned. That was how we did a lot in the beginning. 3 sets of 2 minutes. And let's say that you were a brand new kid and you were like 145 pounds. You had been playing, you're like a freshman or sophomore, you've been playing sports and you're on the JV football team. I'm going to say, all right, go over to the belted march and you're going to do 3 plates. So I give them a number and that number is 45s. How many 45s do you put on the pin? So you might be on 3 plates. That means that set 1, you do 3 plates and then you go jump. And you jump like 5 or 6 times. Your first jump probably sucks because you're going to be real wobbly. Then you're going to take like 30 seconds off, maybe 60 seconds off, somewhere between there, and you're going to do your next jump. So these jumps are all like singles. And you're going to keep going until you have failed to progress for like 3 or 4. So you might go jump like 10, 12 times and then go back and do your second round. Now, your second round, you might add another plate. So you've gone from, 3 plates to now 4 plates. And then the next, you're going to keep doing the same thing. It's basically every round you add weight. So we're trying to make this stimulus stronger and more potent. What I have found is that you have to you have to be strong enough relative to your body weight for this to optimally work. Right. So if you are really heavy, it's going to be hard to get this effect out of this methodology because that means that you have to be very strong because you've got to handle a weight on the belted march that is going to be, in X proportion to your body weight plus your strength level. So
Right.
if your body weight is very high, but you're not very strong, the weight needed to give you that potentiation is going to burn you out because you're not yet strong enough. The
Right.
good news is that simply by doing it, you're getting stronger where you need to get stronger anyways. So one part of it is that we're using loading pins because I had always done this before on ATPs and just never contrasted it with jumping. Though I had heard before about that idea of contrasting it. I had heard it from Louis, and I think heard Bird kind of talk about doing something once, but it wasn't. I don't think that it was a purposeful. I don't think he was purposefully contrasting things. I think it was just he had told me something, and for some reason it stuck in my head. As soon as I saw that kid jump, I was like, "Oh, this is what's happening." But so when you do it with a loading pin, like let's say this drink is a loading pin, your feet have to be way outside of those 45-pound plates. So when your feet are out wide, when your base is wide, you start to get out, to shoulder width or further. You can't lift your leg very high. You can't lift your foot very high, and you can't really root that weight back in your heel. When you watch people a lot of times with ATPs or like a lever style belt squat, their feet will be very narrow and they'll march in this like exaggerated, I always say like they're marching like they're like trying to get a gold star from their teacher, and all their weight is back on their heel. Their foot is not really working a lot. And they're almost turning it into like a hip flexor exercise on the other side, trying to raise that knee so high. Which I think is a sort of an inefficient way to hit your hip flexors. But when you make that base have to go wide, they can't pick their foot up that high because they'll simply fall over, right? So their foot can't go very high, and they can't sit back in their heels. They have to be up on their forefoot. So their heels just kind of like kiss the ground, and you get this flexing, pedaling action off of the ground. And your weight transfers forward in your foot. So you're moving off of your forefoot through your toes the whole way. Now, when we think about jumping, we always hear about like in the all the arguments on Twitter and stuff about what's strong enough and whatnot. You always hear about this mythical kid who can squat 600 pounds and runs a 6 flat 40. I've never met this kid before in my life. I've never
Yeah.
seen this person exist, but I'm told over and over and over that they do.
I
Well,
don't
the
believe they
squat,
actually squat 600 because most of these coaches are scared to have 400 on their back. So I
yeah,
think
yeah,
that's
yeah. The same coach who says I'd never let a kid squat 500 pounds will tell you stories
mm,
about the kid who squatted 700 and couldn't jump.
hmm
And you go like, how do you know he squatted 700? Also, how do you know he couldn't jump? And
He
how
did.
much
Just
do y'all
trust me,
jump?
bro.
And yeah, it's a just trust me, bro. Like, but even within that framework of like, okay, let's solve that problem. Um, the squat, a squat is all about the relation of your hip to your knee, right? You're dropping your hip in relative to your knee. So to think about it in terms of like running, your knee comes up relative to your hip and
Yeah.
drives down. So that's how we're creating force to, stick into the ground, is by
Right.
basically, especially accelerating, we're essentially squatting down with each leg
Yeah.
to create that force on that downward swing.
Yep.
But you've never seen a fast person. There's never been a truly fast person who is weak in terms of their interaction with the ground. Right? You hear track coaches say, like you want to hammer the ground, a hammer will bounce down the rubber of the track. Um, you want to, you want your feet basically to pop almost like, drumsticks off of the head of a snare, not like a big soft mallet, or
Right.
I've said before, you want to be an overinflated basketball,
Right.
right? You want to have the overinflated basketball, it bounces significantly higher than an underinflated basketball. But so all that is to say, the squat tells us what's happening at the hip and at the knee. But where do we make contact with the track or with the ground? When we jump, when we cut, when we change directions, accelerate, decelerate, everything that we do, pitch, what's the like where are you creating that force from? It's all through the ground. Hitting, it's through the ground. So how do you interact with the ground? Through your feet,
That's your
through
point
your
of
feet, and
contact.
particularly, yeah, through your forefoot. So
Yeah.
being stronger at the point of contact means you're going to have more efficient, transfer of energy into the ground, and have more efficient, like transfer of those reaction forces back through your body.
So is the foot strength, that's a multiplier from your hip and your knee? Is that what you're saying? Is that strike is just going to make that force from the hip and the knee more efficient? So when you strike the ground, you're putting more force into it.
Yes, and also most kids, you think about the things that have. I'm 37. And I explain this to my kids all the time, and I often like marvel at how much younger you are, and yet you get so much of this. I grew up in a time when your cell phone didn't do anything except for make calls and occasionally send texts. And no one had enough texts and no one had enough minutes. So most of us just had this brick Nokia status symbol in our pocket, and the only person who was ever going to call was mom. And when you wanted to see your friends, you went out to the park. I've driven by, probably half a dozen parks today. I might have seen one person at the park. But when I was young, I would ride my bike or run or hike or whatever to the park every day, because that's the only way you were going to see people. It was either go to the park and see, people and play and do whatever. Not everyone wanted to play the game that I wanted to play. They're playing football, we were playing football. They're playing basketball, we're playing basketball. I had friends who liked baseball. I didn't like baseball, but shit, we were going to play baseball if that's what the kids were doing. So that was so common. So kids ran around, they got a lot of ground contacts and a lot of different angles. They were falling off monkey bars and jumping around, just like we were more robust. That's why you didn't see the same kind of soft tissue injuries and stuff. We were building up a work capacity from a very young age, and we were entering high school significantly stronger than these kids today are.
Yeah.
The average kid was much faster. The average kid was also much thinner.
Right.
Like all of these things have multiplied. And now you get kids who they haven't had near the same number of ground contacts. They haven't had the vast variability, and they don't have any work capacity, and they're weak.
Yeah.
And on top of that, like even comparing, shoes 20 years ago versus today, they use a lot softer foam in shoes today. They
Yeah.
often skimp on like the rubber and stuff at the bottom. It makes the shoes really light and really comfortable, but it also means like all these things come together to basically say like we're we're typically like very weak at the feet.
Yeah.
We like as a people, we have bad feet.
Yeah.
Um, so it's often something that's lagging behind.
Hmm.
Um, it's not something that most kids seem to train, like when they get a Planet Fitness membership or something, or wherever they go, or their dad's garage. They work on, they deadlift, they squat, they might clean, they definitely bench, but their like idea of fitness at that point is in a small little box
Right.
where they lift things up and down and their feet are rooted the whole time.
Yeah.
Um, so,
So you
you
think
know,
that's where the disconnect is when people say, strong doesn't make you fast? Is that where this disconnect is happening? Is that they're only evaluating one part of this whole kind of, I guess, complex thing that's happening when you're contacting? They're not accounting for below the knee.
yeah, they're not accounting for below the knee. They're also usually trying to correlate the squat to like max velocity.
Hmm.
And squatting is not max velocity. Max velocity is a hinge.
Talk more
Max
about that.
velocity.
Talk more about that.
So at some point, I'm going to make a very detailed video on this. Um, but so as I said earlier, I have a daughter who's basically a year and a half old. Okay.
Right.
Now, anyone who's coached, like let's say high school boys in particular, they know that they're bad at hinging.
Yes.
Like until coached, most children are terrible at hinging. All right. So let's go back through this. From all of this comes back to like evolution and how we live, what our bodies are evolved to do, how they're evolved to develop, and then how our actual lifestyle impacts that. So when think about a baby. When babies first learn to walk or they first learn to stand, babies, you'll never see a baby bend over at the waist to pick something up. Their torsos are very long. Their heads are gigantic compared to their body. If a baby leans forward, it will fall forward.
Yeah.
It doesn't like the dimensions, the proportions of a baby. So for them to pick something up, they drop into a squat.
Right.
The very first movement pattern that we learn is squatting.
Hmm.
In terms of something that is, similar to like what's in the gym.
Right.
We learn squatting, that movement pattern, long, long, long before we learn to hinge,
Okay.
right? Walking is a hinge, but it's a very like gentle hinge. My daughter just started running, really like in the past month, she started to do what you can confidently call a run. Watch a baby run when they first figure it out. They basically do high knees. They barely propel themselves forward because, again, their feet are just pistoning up and down.
Hmm.
It's just straight up and down, very little like curving or hooking back, or if you watch what my elbow does there, hinging to create this arc of force that creates horizontal propulsion. when a sprinter comes out of the blocks, they're all the angle of the force of their shins. You'll hear a lot of like sprint coaches say, like your shins will tell you where you're projecting.
Mm-hmm.
Your shins tell you where you're projecting because you're pistoning your foot straight down relative to your torso. So if this is your torso, your shin is raising and then firing down. When
Yep.
you accelerate, that's what it looks like. Only it's this. Your torso leans forward. You're aiming your projection, and then you're hammering your feet down. And they're moving you forward because you're tilted forward, so that that down relative to your torso is the same direction. And that pushes you forward. But eventually you start pushing yourself so fast forward that you have to rise. Otherwise you will fall because
Oh,
you won't be able to pull your feet back over fast enough.
right.
So once upright, that motion now looks almost from the side. If I just took whatever leg is closest to me and I can do this in video. If I have After Effects, I can do this easily. I have After Effects. I will do this one day just to point this out. But if I just took, Usain Bolt sprinting at max velocity, his knees don't actually come up very high anymore. They stay well below his hip.
Mm-hmm.
And you watch his shin and his feet start to get out in front of his knee now.
Yeah.
So it's not hammering straight down anymore. Now it's sort of sweeping out,
Oh, yeah.
striking just ahead of his body underneath. And then, there's so much more rotation now. So if I were to take that shin that is going like this and I were to lock it in the camera, what you would see is this action of the butt raising up over the foot and then going back behind it. And you would
Mm-hmm.
see that torso leaning forward and coming up, leaning forward and coming up. And so if I just showed you that and I didn't show you, and I, locked that foot so it was basically 90 degrees the whole time, what you would see is like a Dimmel deadlift from the side.
Okay.
An explosive set of, partial range of motion RDLs. Because that's the only way that you're going to create horizontal forces when you're upright like that.
Right.
So, so that's one thing is everyone looks at like correlations of the squat to max velocity running or to longer distances. People look at like the broad jump and the 40 and they go, oh, see, the broad jump's all about acceleration. No, the broad jump is a hinge. The reason why the broad jump has a high correlation to the 40 is because most people are upright by 20 yards. So half of the 40 is max velocity or near max velocity for most people. It's max velocity mechanics. It's upright mechanics. Right. So, of course, a jump that correlates to the back half of the 40 is going to have correlation to the 40. What they won't tell you is the broad jump doesn't have a lot of correlation on the field.
Interesting. And so is that why you see the correlation between the vertical jump and the squat
on the field? Huh?
Is that why you see a large correlation between the squat and the vertical jump?
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Because they're basically the same thing.
Right. Okay. So what do you do deadlift wise to kind of build that max velocity? So you said like an RDL, like a Dimmel deadlift. Talk to me about kind of what we're doing with the deadlift. How are we kind of leveraging that to improve 10-yard flies or max V, however you measure that?
Basically, like my favorite thing, my bread and butter is sumo deadlifts. So we'll do mostly heavy triples as a sort of secondary exercise between our main lift being the squat most days. And then before we start to get into things like reverse hypers, Nordics, back extensions or back raises that we do our back, we have a bunch of 45-degree back raises. We don't really do those for our back. We do them for upper hamstring and glute. We do our Nordics for that lower hamstring, the back of the knee. And then we do our reverse hypers for lower back and glute. And then we do our marching or our sled drags for calf, ankle, foot. So we hit like every part of that posterior
Yeah.
chain, all for the purpose of basically running and change of direction. I like the sumos a lot more because um, it's less fatiguing on the back. Um, more posterior chain, more glute, um, and also again more of that wide stance.
Are
We'll
you
also
deadlifting multiple times a week?
um, we go through periods of doing it multiple times a week. We also go through periods where like we don't do it.
Always after
So I've
squatting.
taken always after squatting, yeah.
Okay, that's what
So
my Fridays look like.
yeah, in the past, I've done essentially a max effort day that was almost always a deadlift,
Right.
and it worked pretty well. But I've found that our deadlifts make the exact same progress when we do them after squats, and our squats
Yeah.
make better progress. So I've
Yeah.
shifted over the last couple of years and talked to you a ton, um, and kind of taking things that I had experimented with Jared, and
Yeah.
then again, you kind of having a more sort of like systemized approach that I then tweaked to be able to like implement kind of across the board. Because my big challenge is, especially dealing with so many teams um, and so many kids at a small school where like everyone is, a very high percentage of kids are on two, sometimes three or four different sports.
Yeah.
Um, so never really knowing like who's going to come in that day, and then
Mhm.
kids are always sick.
Yeah.
It's again, to go back to things that weren't a thing 20 years ago. Kids didn't miss for like a haircut 20 years ago.
Right.
um, like honestly, I can never, even just like 4 or 5 years ago, like I couldn't remember a kid. It's like the last 2 years, all of a sudden every kid misses when they have a haircut.
True. I've
And
had a few.
yeah.
I don't.
And it'll even be the kid saying, like, hey, coach, I have to get a haircut. My mom wants me to get a haircut. And I'll see the parent come in and I'm like, I'm their age now. So I'm like,
Yeah.
guys, when was this ever acceptable?
Right.
You know, but people work longer hours. Just society keeps changing. So
Right.
um
Um. So a training session for you then. So let me get this right. So you guys are gonna jump. Okay, we're gonna do our weighted jumps, unweighted jumps. We're gonna do that burn the ladders protocol we talked about. We're gonna box squat. Okay, and then after days that we deadlift after, and then we're gonna do all of our accessory work. So you're layering it kind of in the similar fashion that I do with dynamic effort, and then your kind of max or brief maximal tension, and then your repetition effort. So you're giving these kids everything every day. What kind of advantages, I guess, do you
yeah.
see with doing it like that?
um One is that we get the just again getting the frequency of exposure,
Yeah.
and then not needing to take as long on any one thing. Um, we definitely, whatever our like meat and potatoes exercise is that day, whether it's squat on a lower body day or bench on an upper body day, I give my kids little timers.
Yeah.
And so like this week, almost every kid is on 6 minutes of rest.
Between those main
um,
lifts.
between those main lifts, yeah. um, then when we get to our accessories, so it'll be on your main lift, on your secondary lift, um, you know, and then we'll start to pick up the pace, and then you get to things where you can kind of just bounce from one thing to the next,
Right.
and you'll just get a couple sets. If we're doing Nordic curls, they're just going to have 2 sets of 6, and we'll load those. um, I have a sixth grade boy who does, I think he got 6 the other day with 20 pounds dead
Did you post
stopping on
that?
the
I think I
ground.
saw that. I think you posted
I
that.
posted when he did it with 10 for like
Okay.
one,
Okay.
and now
Now he's
he's
doing
doing
20 for
20 for like
six.
6. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Um, So the last week at Elite FTS, AJ Dobson, that same fighter,
Yeah.
um, he did a 50-pound weighted Nordic for Guinness for the world record. And I said, congratulations, like I'm going to show this to some of my kids. And I said, I have my best kid right now uses 20s and dead stops at the bottom. But he's going into 7th grade now. And he said, oh, my record's as good as done. I said,
Yeah.
yeah, like nicely. But I know, I think like Josh Bryant's kid also, like
Yeah.
he probably could go take the record right now. I think I've seen a
Right.
video of him doing like 40.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so with those, that's another thing where like we used to do more sets, higher reps, especially on our accessories. We've always been pretty low rep on our main movement. Never gone over 6. I don't think in the entirety of the time that I've been there
Yeah.
at either school. But we started going a lot lower rep on our accessories, and I track all my kids' numbers on everything.
Yeah.
So they write down their numbers, pull up like a sheet here. So like here's a sheet, like each one of these columns is a goal number, and then there's a blank column right next to it. So there's their name, goal, blank space, goal, blank space, exercise
Right.
labeled across the top. So they've got a goal that I've assigned them, and they are filling in what they actually got to successfully. But so pushing the intensity on the accessories was a lot easier to get compliance and to start tracking it
Yeah.
when they only had to do like 2 sets of 6.
Right.
Uh, for reverse hypers, they got to do 1 set of 30,
Okay.
because it's more your lower back. Look on a medical chart, it's all white and gray, and that's because tendons, ligaments are white and gray because they don't get great blood flow. So
Yeah.
we're going to do really high reps on that for blood flow. But everything else is going to be very low reps, very high intensity, um, trying to, number one, get them to actually push themselves,
Right.
um, and then get it done in a manner that, I've made a big change in the last like year and a half or so to try and get our workouts in, to try and get the same adaptation or greater rate of adaptation from less work and from less time.
Yeah.
And that's helped a lot of our kids for sports like baseball start to gain weight.
Right.
And it's helped their outputs um, on their main movements trend way
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
I think in large part because kids aren't trying to, they're not saving themselves for anything anymore.
Yes.
So,
Um, Something that me and you talked about just a few weeks ago, and something that I've continually seen that I reference, kind of listening to Jared speak, and kind of this minimalist idea of training, right? To where we're going to have less things to do, but we're going to do it a lot better. Like
mhm,
Jared's kids, a lot of their training, I had him on the podcast. I know you probably listened to it, where they might just squat and jump on a day, or they might just bench
mhm.
and do triceps and maybe their inclines and be done. Like only a select few exercises. Is that kind of what you're seeing as well? Because I've noticed the same thing with my kids, to where if we can just do a few things really, really well, they just continue to drive up. But even if they skip some of the other accessory work, if they're just doing their main lifts, their jumps, and maybe that supplemental, their numbers just keep skyrocketing. You seeing the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, like, and that goes back to again, being around West Side, being around, Dave Hoff, um, and sort of being around very good and often. This isn't to directly call Hoff lazy, but to see how very high end athletes appear lazy.
Right.
Um, and often it's analogous to like Tony Holler and Feed the Cats, like, those really fast kids. The trick to progressing them is to get them to compete, to get their effort to be super high.
Right.
But because because their outputs are so high, they can't really do that much.
Right.
And if you have to keep like they also can't express their full, they can't handle nor can they express their full sort of capacities unless they're like totally locked in.
Right.
And if they're totally locked in, it hardly takes anything to get them to progress.
Yeah.
Um, so looking at the workouts and going like, okay, I don't care how much the kids do if they're getting better.
Right.
So they can do next to nothing, you know, um, if they just squat and they squat with intent, their first step or their first set, literally like their first working set can be enough to get them significantly stronger.
Right.
But it's got to be balls out. Like
Yeah.
it's got to be full throttle. Um, so figuring out that like not every kid wants to work as hard as I do. Not every, like there's also just kids are going to get distracted and stuff. Like I know from filmmaking, people's attention spans, you can get a good 45 minutes from people.
Right.
Um, you know, it's hard to make. Hollywood keeps doing it, but it's hard to make a good 3-hour movie.
Right.
You know, and likewise, I might be able to have a great 3-hour workout
Yeah.
because I love this stuff. This
Right.
is my thing.
Right.
Um, Other kids, like I'm just trying to be happy about them doing something that's going to give them the stimulus.
Right.
So if they miss 3/4 of the workout, but they got the main thing and they did it really hard, I'm gonna be pretty cool with it until their numbers
Stop moving.
until they stall or
Yeah.
regress. Um, and also like acknowledging that like everyone is changing all the time, not just physically but mentally.
Yeah.
You know, you need that kid to be locked in and have fun for one set long before they will be locked in and totally on board for a full workout. So, like rewarding the kid for even that partial effort of like, well, you did really well your first exercise.
Yeah.
Like maybe in a few weeks, you'll start to do well through a second. Like we'll build you over time because a big thing is like they just have to feel comfortable.
Right.
And not just comfortable, but like you have to have when people know what they're doing will actually like bear some fruit, it's really easy to get them to do anything.
Right.
When people think what they're doing will bear fruit, they'll try sometimes.
Yeah.
When people don't think what they're doing will bear fruit, they won't try at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
So getting them to try like, in the same way that like I'm big on building work capacity
Yeah.
slowly over time,
Yeah.
building interest slowly and over time,
Yeah.
building competency slowly and over time, so that a kid who's a timid eighth grader becomes your loud boisterous like sort of alpha type sophomore
Yeah.
who can basically run the workout himself and
Yeah.
keep everyone around him in line and keep everyone motivated. That same kid might be too timid and shy to like that same kid might just disengage and stand there next to a rack and watch everyone else go. And then you say like, hey man, so what have you done today? And they'll say, I did my warm-up set. How long ago? 30 minutes ago. Why haven't you been going? Well, everyone else was going. It's like, yeah, you
Yeah.
establish an order and you stay when it's your turn.
Yeah.
And they just let their turn get skipped once. They don't say anything. And
Yeah.
then the next thing you know, they've been standing there catatonic in the corner for 45 minutes. And
Right.
you go, hey man, the workout's over and you didn't write anything down today.
Right.
Like that same kid will become a leader if you foster that.
Kind of nurture that
Uh,
leadership a bit.
yeah, just nurture, like, just realize that, like, and again, I see this happen so often often in sports, especially, sport practices, where a kid who is loud and boisterous because they're good when they're in like middle school, it's typecast by coaches basically as like, oh, that kid's good. And sooner or later, it's like, no, that kid's like got bad work ethic. That kid's not actually a contributor, but the
Yeah.
coach giving him opportunities because he's got this bias based on that kid feeling comfortable.
Right.
Oddly enough, that kid feeling comfortable is what eventually prevents him from working hard. Meanwhile, the
Yeah.
other kid who's quiet, who it takes him a long time to feel comfortable, by the time that kid does feel comfortable and develops into something, the coach doesn't see it anymore.
Yeah.
So it's I'm always very cognizant of like what each kid could become, which is I think what every good coach, like
Yeah.
Louis would say, like the plight of a coach is like seeing seeing someone's potential beyond what they can believe.
Right.
Something like that. I
Yeah.
don't know that he phrased it that eloquently, but it's that where like, I'll have um and to drift off on another tangent, this is part of why I hate like goals. You have to have a goal, but the goal has to always move because you will never hit your goal. You will die before you hit your goal. So
Yeah.
you better be shifting that goal further and further and further out. Otherwise, you turn into sort of like what, within West Side versus the World, like AJ Roberts, where he squats 1200. 1200 was the number. He never readjusted the goal. So the second he hit the goal, he had no clue what to do with himself
Yeah.
and he crumbled. High school kids, kids will set a goal for themselves. A lot of times they set two types of goals: insane goals that they don't really believe in. They're like dreams. They don't
Yeah.
actually believe they can get there. They fantasize about it, but they don't believe that there's a viable connection to it. And then they'll set goals that they know that they can hit. But because they know that they can hit them, they'll keep pushing them down the road. I just want to bench 200 pounds. And that kid will get stuck at 195. And every week he'll leave feeling good. Like, I didn't get it, but I got 195.
Yeah.
And you go like, that's cute one time. We can't have that.
Yeah.
So like
The
I'll
bar has
have,
to always raise.
yeah, I'll straight up lie to kids and misload a bar if I see that happening over and over again. And just like, I'll put 205 on, but just sneak the last fives on. So the kid
Yeah.
thinks he's doing 195 because the kid knows I can do 195. 195 is a number they fully believe in.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden they feel like, oh shit, this is heavy. And they go, I better, I better figure this out. And they lock
Yeah.
up 205. And you
Yeah.
say to them, dude,
Yeah.
like, go check the weight. I think they misloaded the bar. Like, that's your job. You're supposed to check that. And they go
Yeah.
look and, oh, it's 205. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah.
Because you thought it was 195 and you weren't going to let yourself off the hook with 195, but you would with 200.
Yeah.
So we said, F that. We skipped it and went 205.
Yeah.
Um, I'll only do that if I like am confident that's what's happening with the kid. But
Yeah.
it works every time when I do it. But yeah, it's this constant. It goes back to what I've said like earlier to you today about like being curious and not wanting to settle it good enough, not wanting to
Right.
settle it close, but being
Yeah.
curious of like what is past
What's
what's
further?
past the mountaintop.
Yeah.
There's a valley, but then there's something past the valley.
Yeah.
And there's something past that. There's something past that. So, you know, that as soon as you summit one thing, you're just on to the next thing.
Yeah.
Because standing at the top is not actually that satisfying.
Yeah.
Because then you've lost all the mystery. It's climbing the next mountain that's satisfying.
Right. I have a question to go back to kind of some of your programming stuff. So I know that you still are using the brief maximum tense. You're still using a little bit more reps and things like that. How many working sets are you giving your kids? You said 6 minutes or so. How many working sets do you give them in a workout typically?
They get 4 working sets on the first exercise.
Yeah.
I've gone down to 3. I've found my kids do better with 4.
Okay.
They do better with 4 than with 5. So just dialing it in. And
Yeah.
then, say on a squat day like yesterday, we did 4 sets of 4, followed by 3 sets of 3 sumo deadlift, followed by 2 sets of 6 reverse lunge. So the sumo deadlift and the reverse lunge are kind of, the secondary movements,
Yeah.
and then followed by Nordics, back raise, reverse hyper, belted march, and then closing out with the jumps. And we've been doing a lot of like supine med ball throws because I have radar as well.
Right. So what kind of things are going to be staples in your training? So I've heard you say Nordics a few times. I've heard you say, your hypers, those are staple things. Box squats, I'm assuming are some of your
Mhm.
staples. So a lot of your workouts look a lot the same, right? A lot of your workouts are they look a lot alike. They're not too different
Yeah.
from another. Do you think that's a kind of
No.
a mistake a lot of people make is they try to vary things too much?
Yeah. I like will drop, sometimes we'll swap sumo for the reverse lunge. Sometimes we'll drop one or the other, or if they've had an especially hard couple weeks or something, maybe it might just be like squat, jump, sleds,
Yeah.
or squat, sleds, jump. Um, but yeah, paring those rotations down. They're reverse hyper. Sometimes it's going to be two-legged. Sometimes it's going to be one-legged.
Yeah.
Um, Occasionally, sometimes we're going to lower the weight, and then they're going to do 2 sets of 30 instead of 1 set of 30.
Okay.
Um, on occasion, if just training has gotten stale, we might come in and we just say like, okay, cool, uh, we're doing rounds of belted marches, and we're all going to jump PRs.
Yeah.
And the kids will go, well, what does that mean? I go like, you have to do 2 rounds, but if you jump a PR, you don't have to do a third. And then other kids will go, like, well, what does that mean for me? And well, if you haven't jumped a PR yet, then you got a third, then you got a
Yeah.
fourth, then you got a fifth, then you got I've
Can't
had
jump.
kids
Yeah.
do like 7 rounds and
Yeah.
finally hit a PR. And I've also had kids where they do 4 rounds and I go, okay, man, like I know it's
Yeah.
not there today. Like
Yeah.
you can move on. The great stuff about though is that like you're still going to get that um, adaptation eventually of like the strength of the foot and ankle
Yeah.
and the calf and everything. So even if it doesn't work in terms of the potentiation,
Okay.
um, upper body, it's going to be bench, incline, either a 2 or a 4 board press. So we'll normally go like today was 4 sets of 3 bench, 3 by 3 4 board, 2 by 6 incline, and then pull ups, some landmine, rear delt flies, basically trying to end almost back in like their throwing position.
Yeah.
So walking forward or backwards along that landmine to wherever they come back to whatever feels like a comfortable throwing position.
Yeah.
And then, um, I'll do things like uh, if I've had situations before where like my volleyball girls, um, I hadn't seen them for like 6 weeks or something because of scheduling, and like they came back and I was just like, y'all all have terrible like upper backs. So we're gonna take, just the safety squat bar and do, lean forward over like a glute ham and do I can't remember what they're called, but there's little like Blaine Sumner like upper back sort of good mornings with a safety squat bar, or my baseball kids right now, I've got them as sort of a finisher type movement doing snatch grip, like shrug rows,
Okay.
trying to, I just got annoyed that like I have kids who are up like 20 pounds of body weight in the last like 6, 7 months. And I'm like, you still have no traps and, you still have no upper back. And We had a scout come out for the Tigers, and I was telling him about one of our kids, and I said, yeah, he's almost 180 pounds. This kid's a freshman. He throws high 80s, and he goes, really? And then he said, like, oh yeah, I can see his legs. But I was just like, I don't like the way that he just looked at his upper body and said, really?
Right.
So I was like, that's it. We got, like, I got too many baseball players who have, no traps and no upper
We
back.
gotta
So we'll
fill those
fix that.
jerseys out.
Yeah. But then like things like skull crushers will come in and out. Um, Lots of different variations of like dumbbell cleans or snatches.
You do
Again,
rollbacks?
trying to get something that's sort of the antithesis of that throw forward.
Yeah.
Um, and we'll normally do those from a seated position because I'm trying to take the lower body completely out.
Right.
And from that seated position, having them put the weight all the way down on the ground, make contact between their feet, which gives them just like that added little scapula stretch at the bottom. And then pulling up almost like a lawnmower,
Yeah.
cleaning and pressing.
Do you do dumbbell rollbacks?
No, because we don't have like I have so many kids to the dumbbells. So we
Okay.
lean a lot more on like the skull crushers and barbell movements because um with things like rollbacks, it's everyone like gets to a point where they're all around the same weight.
Yeah.
And if we had more dumbbells, I would do a lot more stuff like that. I do tape presses and stuff.
Yeah.
If I'm in a small group, I love stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I can progress kids faster in a small group.
Yeah.
But again, those are the kind of things where like just looking at my logistics and going like, we can get more work, we can get more good work done because if we lean too heavy on dumbbells, kids are going to get caught in those in betweens where they're not going to wait for the one weight up, so they're going to always go like one weight down.
Right. So something else I had a question on, and we've talked a lot about like sprint programming, me and you personally. What does your sprint program look like? I know you were doing a lot of flies before. What are you kind of doing now for sprinting? How often are you sprinting? You still doing a lot of fly stuff? You doing short flies? Talking about kind of your sprint programming.
um so in the summer it changes because they redo our track like every summer. I don't understand why, but just I lose access to the track every summer. Plus our track is like a quarter mile from our weight room. Um, so during the summer, we lean a lot more on like very short sprints, um, 5, 10 flies, 10, 10 flies. Um, we'll do because our weight room like kind of spills out onto this patio, and the patio has big sections of concrete that are like 7.5 feet. So two of those sections is 15 feet, so it's 5 yards. Um, we'll do a lot of like change of direction stuff often at the end of the workout. I'll just set up like, we'll do 5, 10, 5, 10 fives. We'll track that. There's not really give me this many reps. It's, the kids are all trying to break their PRs on that. The sprint work, they're going to do typically like 2 to 4 reps unless they're feeling really good. But a lot of times because of scheduling, that's going to be at the end of the workout. So on an upper body day, it doesn't really matter. The upper body workout kind of just gets them warmed up and woken up. Because a
Yeah.
lot of these kids, during the summer, our workouts will run like 10 a.m. to 12 to noon. So at 10 a.m., that kid might have just rolled out of bed at 9:45. So he's not really awake. They're not going to be good sprints. So he might go in at the end of the workout, lasers are up and he goes and tries to, break a PR or something on It might be as little as one attempt if he just feels completely gassed.
Right.
But like 1 to 4. Um, we'll start then when we get into the school year, I'll usually get 2 days out at the track that are a little more regimented, and we'll try and make at least one of those days a true max V day with flies, where we might do it with wickets or cones to try and extend their stride length.
I like it.
And that's a thing that like very, very few people do, that again
Sure.
I just took from Bird.
Yeah.
Um, and um, I'll set up like 2 lanes on so on an 8-lane track, we'll have 2 lanes or 2 sets of lasers that are each 4 lanes wide. And then in between on each center line of the track, I'll set up cones that are in different colors, and the kids, based on their best speed, will be assigned a different cone, and each cone length is 3 inches different than the other cone lengths. So the slow cones might be running 6 feet 6 inches, and the fast cones might be running 7 feet 9 inches or something. And we'll pair the kids so that they're racing and trying to get through those extreme
Yeah.
lengths. And every time they PR, we'll basically bump them up a level. Because when we bump them up a level, all of a sudden they're going to slow down a little because they can't figure out how to get over the next cone.
Yeah.
And eventually they realize the only way to get over the next cone is to carry even more speed in. Right?
You kind of do the same thing with your hurdle jumps, don't you? Because you
Yeah.
measure ground contact, so
I
it's basically the same exact thing, just with the jumps, right?
Yeah. And our hurdle jumps typically will be another thing that's like at the end of the workout.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, the hurdle jumps are a similar kind of system. I like systems.
Yeah.
I like things that have like a leveled sort of progression to them. And
Makes it
I
predictable.
like it makes it predictable, but also gives the kids like that next target.
Yeah.
Again, I'm constantly just trying to get the kid to go to the next thing, to go to the next thing.
Yeah.
Um, so with like Jared's dumbbell system, if let's say you jump 20 inches this week with 15-pound dumbbells, and then next week we go to 20 or to 20-pound dumbbells, and you jump 18 at the start of the week, but by the end of the week you're jumping 20 or
Yeah.
20.5 maybe. So
Right.
we got you to jump even higher, even though you're carrying 10 total pounds more.
Yeah.
And then the next week, the weight went up again. So your jump went down, but through the course of the week, you progressed back. Now you go back to that first week,
No,
the
it's up a lot.
15 pounders, and you jump like
Yeah.
22.5. And it just keeps rolling over that way. Where
It's the
when
same.
I get a kid who's consistent, they'll make like 1.7 inches for a
Yeah.
while.
Right.
Um, so yeah, we'll do kind of a similar thing with the flies, or we'll start with a 5 yard lead in, and then we'll build up to like 2 with the 5 yard lead in, and then 2 with the 10 yard lead in, and then 2 with the 15, 2 with the so they might build up to eventually doing like 6 where they're PRing, on the second one, basically at each length.
Yeah.
Um, and we'll just kind of do this ladder and see like within our, hour or so, like how many good reps can we get in.
Yeah.
Um, the basics of it are we're going to try and hit a true max V at least once a week.
Okay.
If we can, we're going to do it probably twice a week, because everything that we do in the weight room is that short area acceleration.
Yeah.
So looking for something that's um, not as sort of redundant there. And again, going back to like why athletes are so bad at hinging. Sprinters have to be good at hinging because they get
Yeah.
up to that full speed. So, getting baseball kids, getting, volleyball girls and stuff who are never really all out sprinting, never getting out of
Right.
acceleration, getting them actually upright, um, getting those even faster, more intensive ground contacts, um, racking them up, basically 10 to 15 on each leg on a good pass at max velocity. For the baseball guys, it just melting time off of a 60.
Yeah.
I've had kids go and in front of pro scouts on full laser systems go 6'5", next to, guys who got MLB contracts in literally the same workout.
Yeah.
And yeah, then the hurdle hop stuff, which is really cool because it's, again, going back to that interplay with the ground, gives you an ability to build elasticity, not just build like the physical component, but also the cognitive component of like understanding the rhythm and bounce and timing and giving the athlete a feel for what a good contact actually feels like versus a bad, and
Right.
getting them to the point where they can feel the difference between like a 0.18 or a 0.17 and a 0.13. Like when an athlete, because your human eye can't see it, you can sometimes sort of hear it, but it happens so fast you can't really see it. But you can feel it when you are that athlete.
Yeah.
So we'll set up the hurdles. I've got that big blue gopher mat,
Yeah. The broad jump mat.
uh,
Yeah.
the broad jump mat, which goes out to 15 feet,
That's it.
which is crazy. But at the same time, now I'm like, shit, man, I want one that goes out to 60 feet
I've
because
noticed that too.
it's got the inches and everything on there.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
We
I'm,
we made a bra. I made my own. So I just basically took tape and and a couple, me and a kid basically measured out to this little turf strip in our weight room. And so, what I had last year, we had one that went to like 12 foot. And then this year we redrew it and we put it to 15 foot. And I'm like, well, kids want to obviously jump to the end of it. And the shorter that broad jump is, the shorter they're going to think, well, that's the end of it. So if you lengthen it, then they're going to, just mentally want to jump further. And if you give them that kind of longer gauge, they tend to jump a lot further. So I've noticed that too. If you increase that broad jump distance, they just jump better.
yeah. So when is this coming out?
I don't know. Probably it could be this weekend or it could be next weekend.
Okay. Um, so if it comes out next weekend,
Yeah.
I can say more stuff.
Okay. We'll just push it because I have a podcast episode I just did on like motor unit recruitment and that stuff. That was supposed to drop, I think, Friday. So we'll push yours in the following weekend so we can get the good stuff.
Okay. So what I do with I don't have a production unit in front of me, but this is one of the test units from like a year ago that I melted in the sun. Um, so with the OVR Jump, a really cool jump device that is stellar at ground contact times. Um, I'll set up on that gopher mat 4 hurdles, and I'll keep track so that every kid has records at I can progress my hurdles in so many different ways. Going again back to the levels concepts that I like. One way that I can progress my hurdles, obviously, is I have adjustable hurdles, and I'll set them the standard height that everyone starts at is 18 inches. So starting at 18 inches, and if you can start with one hurdle. If a kid can clear 18 inches, can they then clear a second hurdle at 18 inches? And let's say at 3 feet distance between hurdles, which is not that much. If you think about like the length of my foot with my shoe is almost 14 inches. So the middle third of that section, if I clear that hurdle by a foot, I am over a third towards the next hurdle. Um, but so I'll work up to those 4 hurdles. each at 18 inches. And I'll put the OVR jumps in between the hurdles, measuring, creating zones that I can measure the ground contact.
Right.
So with 4 hurdles, that means that we have 3 zones to measure. Each zone's got the jumps on it, the OVR jump. So it's measuring the ground contact time down to the thousandth of a second. And now when my kids can hit all 3 jumps faster than 0.15, which is very fast. So the first day, it's really hard for anyone to progress. But when they can progress that, we'll go up 6 inches. So they'll go to 24 inches. So now they need to create more vertical force, but we don't give them any more time. So what happens is, let's say they got to where they were hitting, 0.39, 0.42, or 0.139, 0.142, 0.141. Their slowest was 0.142 on 18 inches on a 4 by 3 foot hurdle. Four hurdles, 3 foot spacing, 18 inches tall. So now their record for that height is 0.142, the slowest of those 3. If they had hit 0.13, 0.13, 0.16, then they would have to stay until that 0.16 got under 0.15.
Yeah.
What I found in transitioning from a big mat, a just jump mat, an expensive heavy mat system where I was only measuring 1 ground contact to suddenly measuring multiple, is I found that kids could essentially fake 1 good ground contact. So if you put it as the last one, they would be slow, 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 and then tap and barely make it over.
Right.
And then when you started to go, okay, let's do 2 ground contacts, they would go slow, tap, tap, or, slow, tap, like bam, slow again. You had a significantly lower percentage of kids who could go tap, tap and get over. Then you go 3, and all of a sudden it drops that percentage down again. So you get to 3 or beyond, like real quickly, you find out who can actually bounce and who can't. And you make them just have to, they just keep drilling it. And I don't have to tell them like, hey, give me a minimum or something, because it ends up being like, it's gamified and it's pretty fun.
Yeah.
But then we can extend it out to say 3.5 or 4 feet in between hurdles. And you can have a record there. And you can do the same thing where when they hit under the record, you raise the hurdle height. Or you can go, hey, they hit under the record, let's extend the hurdle out further. So, we've got 3 foot records at 18 inches, at 24 inches, at 30 inches. We've got 4 foot records at 18, 24, 30. We've got 5 foot records. I've got a girl who has 8 foot records. So she bounces through 4 hurdles consecutive, 18 inches off the ground, and hits all of them under 0.1 or under 0.2. I think her best score right now is like 0.19. But so she went under 0.15, under 0.15, 0.19.
Yeah.
But those are 8 feet apart. So that means that when she's jumping into the hurdle, she's about 4 feet in front of the hurdle. Very, very few girls can broad jump 8 feet. And she is doing repeated bounds over 8 feet. One of the really cool things about that is Dan John, it kind of comes from a Dan John thing, talking about range throwing, which I apply this concept to a lot of different, to jumps, to throws. But range throwing is essentially like this discus idea or shot put idea when someone's form kind of gets gunked up because they start trying to muscle it too much and it slows them down. That you move a cone to like 70% of their best throw, and you have them try and see like how little effort can you get over the cone. Now the cone, it's significantly further, it's significantly closer, so it's not challenging at all. And the challenge becomes, how do I hit the same distance doing less, right? which means essentially like you feel like you're doing less from an energy standpoint, from an effort standpoint, but what you're actually doing is you're moving crisper and faster and more efficiently. So you're moving faster with like less tension,
Right.
um, which is going to benefit you. And then you start slowly going, okay, like that was at 70%. Now let's push that push that cone just a little further out.
Yeah.
Let's put it 5 yards further. Let's put it, and all of a sudden you've got a kid basically, encroaching upon or surpassing their old PR while hardly trying. So the hurdles can kind of do the same thing. You put that hurdle out there, the hurdles are 8 feet apart for this girl. She's a 9 foot and change broad jumper. She's an incredible jumper. When she started with me, she was, a 7 foot something jumper a
Yeah.
year ago.
Yeah.
And I've had multiple girls now go over 9 feet, and none of them have ever started over 8.
Yeah.
None of them have ever taken more than a year and a half to hit 9. And we don't broad jump a whole lot,
Yeah.
so like each of them, I think this girl could like broad jump 10 feet, like the way that
Yeah.
she jumps. Um, but doing these hurdles, she's 4 feet from the hurdle,
Right.
and the hurdle's 18 inches. So it's not really that high, but she's concerned about that object 4 feet in front of her. She
Yeah.
doesn't realize that because of her trajectory, she's falling 4 feet past it. And then where's the next hurdle? So she's not, versus looking at just the empty mat and going, man, I got to get all the way out to 8. She's going, I just have to get over 4. And then she lands, and okay, just over the next 4, just over the next 4. So the problem is that 32-foot span is far past the bounds of my 15-foot gopher mat.
Yeah.
So I'm like, man, if I had like a 60-foot mat, then I could just have a chart that has like my inch marks for like, here's, 5 or 6 hurdles if the distance is X or Y.
Yeah.
And I could just go like, okay, she handled those 8-foot hurdles. Now let's go 8-foot 3 hurdles, which to her eye means that hurdle's only an inch and a half further. She's not even going to register. I could do the same thing that I talked about with bench. I could tell her it's an 8-foot hurdle and it's
Yeah.
really 8'3".
Yeah.
And then I could
She wouldn't know.
once I got her acclimated to that, I could give her 8'6". I could keep playing this game until she's jumping 9'6" hurdles, and you strip the hurdles away and all of a sudden she jumps like a 10-2 and she's,
Yeah.
feels like nothing.
Is this one of the ways that you're training elasticity?
Mhm.
So something that I think that a lot of coaches don't know how to do is like we can see acceleration, right? Like we can test acceleration in the weight room with the jumping. We haven't really found a good way, at least across the field of like strength and conditioning. I've never seen anybody have a really good way of measuring or like really kind of progressing elasticity and how to actually measuring that. So essentially, what you have is you have a systemized way to kind of progress elasticity, which is something that's so elusive for many of us, right? Like many athletes we have kind of have that elasticity trained out of them in a way. Like me and Bert have talked about by the time you get,
Mhm.
athletes that, like you said, play outside that have all those ground contacts, they're much more elastic. And at this point, like you might get an athlete that comes in that plays video games all the time. They're not super elastic.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a way that you've basically created a system of increasing elasticity in a pretty efficient way, it sounds like, using this technology.
Yeah. It
That's freaking
it
powerful, man.
definitely like,
That's powerful when you pair it
yeah.
with the strength training you're doing, you pair with your jumping, like you're completely changing kids' lives. You're completely changing their ability to apply force into the ground, completely changing their metrics. They're completely changing their jumping, their sprinting, like from a global level. This is like a holistic training plan to take that average kid and make them great. And I haven't heard anybody talk about developing elasticity like you have.
Yeah, well the whole thing comes down to like, now again, we were trying to create a piece of technology, because OER is not just me.
Yeah.
My uh, I have other, you know, founding co-owners, one of which is our engineer who is a former college baseball player himself who, hasn't coached, but he's familiar enough with a lot of these ideas. Um, So I just dream up like new challenges for him basically and say like, how do we make this real?
Yeah.
Um, and sometimes he has to go like, first off, what is this that you're even talking about? And I really like track, and I really like, you know, I love track because when I was young, I was a thrower. I threw shot put, I threw discus. I competed in like pentathlons and stuff, which was cruel because the 800 meters in there, that's an awful event. But I love track. I still love like watching track and sprinting and stuff. And there's like so much that can be done in track, right? Because it's a lot like how Lou used to say, like he didn't like training football players, not because it was hard to train football players or because he could create change within them, but because if he then handed you over to another coach who didn't know what they were doing or misused you, like then his training, like his training would never blossom and express itself the way that it should have.
Right.
So track, on the other hand, where it's like powerlifting, it's like if you've got it, line up and show it and
Very
go.
measurable, right?
Yeah, it's measurable, and there's nothing. Everyone gets the same gun, everyone goes at the same time.
Right.
Like maybe you get a different lane draw or something, but like there's very little that really gets in your way. It's so self-determined.
Right.
And so a bad coach, your coach can be the worst coach in the world, but he puts you on the line, the gun goes bang, and you run a
Yeah.
fast time. No one can take it away from you.
Right.
Now, the problem being that like the culture of track in so many instances is, you know, it's really bizarre from an economic standpoint. Like I think Tony Holler has talked about a lot, like, how many in terms of talking about like his own progression as a track coach. Track coaches, everyone, a lot of distance coaches have a lot of power within track. And yet, you know, shot put is anaerobic and gives you just as much points as the 3200. The discus gives you just as much points as the 1600. End of distance races, and you've been nullified by a sampling of the throws. Yet there are very few track teams that are run by throws coaches, and they might still have the javelin. Like so they you can actually score more points. If you
Yeah.
just brought distance runners and you just brought throwers, the throwers will score higher. Um, then you throw in, high jump and long jump, and those are so anaerobic and so short, just pure raw explosion. Um, then you start throwing, short hurdles and short sprints, and you go like, okay, maybe if we classify the 8 as middle distance, and we then classify the 4x8, it's like you're going to lose every major meet.
Right.
You're never going to win a state championship if your focus is distance first, right? But if you're sprint first and you actually are into like, hey, let's just get people fast, you are going to be competitive at nearly everything, and you're going to have a chance to like win major meets. And yet people, again, they see that as lazy, and they see long rest times. Like it, there's a certain like almost psychosis of sport coaching just in general, but especially within track, where it's like these events are so short.
Yeah.
And the built-in, it's not like even with football where they have at least the argument of like, what if we go on a 12-play drive and you've got to, you were going against a hurry-up offense. You're not going against a hurry-up meet. Track
Right.
meets are the longest things in the world. They're spaced out so that you run one thing and then you wait 2 hours and you run the next thing and then
Yeah.
you're done for the day and you worked, less than a minute in total. Um, so from that standpoint, it's like, man, and simultaneously they're so long, like shaving, 3/10 off of a 40. That's cool and all, but like, man, you can shave like 3 more tenths off of like a 60,
Right.
right? Just because that added, like do everything you do for a 40 and then add the bird wicket system and watch the back end of their 60 just deteriorate, just like
Yeah.
melt away. And you can have, like you can pump out ridiculous 60 times and then go, wait, we can do even more in 100. What if instead of doing the wickets for a 10-yard segment, we did them for a 20, for a 30? And then like, because elasticity comes into play, I like to look at other little systems and things that I have. I like to look at like the elasticity by comparing, your 10-yard fly to your 20-yard fly. What percentage of your speed do you hold, for that, like there's a massive difference between the kids who can, hold say 98, 99% of their speed from 10 to 20, going from a 10-yard fly to a 20-yard fly. Not the lead in, but the actual fly distance.
Right.
And then the kids who are at say 95%. Those 95% kids are not, they're not elastic at all. And they get dusted. They drop such a big percentage off. So like it shows. They might hit the same peak speed, but they can't maintain it.
Right.
Right. So like, and then you still have all of that, all that real sexy squatty acceleration. You have so many different like things on this buffet where you can go like, let me take a tenth off here and a tenth from there and a tenth from there and 2 tenths over here. And like, let me take all of this. And it's like, without upgrading anything about the kid significantly, you take a kid from, a 12-second to an 11-second 100. And you go, okay, cool. Now we're like in striking distance to do something like really cool and fast and
Yeah.
score a lot of points. And I'm looking at it like, I didn't really make you much better. Like I just tweaked around the edges and a second came off.
Yeah.
And then especially when you meld the weight room with, again, like a very low volume approach, and you give into that idea that, again, like Tony Holler talks about often, of like your game day or your meet day being the hardest thing. But then when you factor all of those ideas in and then go, and now what if we could actually, again, like where this all started, the interplay of the foot and the ground, that's where that energy exchange is happening. And if that is bad, you can't muscle your way to a gold medal
Right.
in those longer sprints. But if that's good, not only does your top end benefit, but your acceleration benefits. Everything benefits from it.
Right.
The whole system benefits.
Right.
And, much like, I know that's said to you many times before, but like absolute qualities have primacy over developmental
Developmental
qualities.
qualities. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think about, like there's rate of force development and absolute force, right? So squatting, we're improving our absolute force, which is raising our relative strength. And then there's a rate of force development through jumping, right? So your potential jumping is constrained by how much force can you actually create in a longer period.
So do you
When
think that
time
absolute force improvement is also rate of force development? I know that I've spoke about this a bit. I know Louis talks about that, but do you kind of see kind of the interconnection, I guess, between rate of force and absolute strength? I know a lot of people try to separate that. You see a lot of value increasing that absolute value, right?
Yeah, because there's, and I know that I've talked to you before about this. There's I need like visuals to like fully explain this, but if we graph it out, essentially, like, just boom, there's a graph, and we've got force on this side and we've got time on this side. and we take two kids who, both jump on a force plate. When we watch when they go down to deload, to load up before they spring up, the force plate goes down it starts at their body weight, it goes down, and then it comes up, right? So we've got this like almost a triangle here going up to a triangle, and then they're losing contact with the ground, and that force is coming back down. So it creates almost two triangles. But really, the slope right here is your rate of force development, essentially.
Yeah.
And to jump higher, you just want this rate of force development to become steeper, right? But you think about like it's constrained. It's always starting at that body weight. We're starting at how much they weigh.
Yeah.
And then the slope of the line is going to be determined by how much force they create at the peak relative to how much they weigh and how much time it takes. So even without improving their actual like neurological rate of force, there is still the physical concept of how much rate of force they're developing. So they're constrained by what percentage they can display within, let's say, a slow kid, 0.4 seconds of that concentric, explosion up. So 0.4 of a second, his slope looks like this. And let's say this is like 60% of his strength. So his like triangle looks like that.
Yeah.
And then you've got this other kid who he's weaker, but his triangle looks like that. So his slope is here, and that gives you a 36-inch jump. And this kid's slope is here, and that gives you a 32-inch jump. Well, what if we just make this kid's high point up here? Let's make his line extend up like this. And it still takes him the same 4 or 5 tenths of a second. His slope is now higher. His effective rate of force development outpaces the kid who has an internal rate of force development that is superior. But on top of that, you cannot move that fast and still take that long to get off the ground. So even though your brain isn't firing any faster,
Yeah.
you can't stay in contact with the ground that long because now you're moving too fast because you're too strong. So even if the synapses aren't firing any faster, even if no information is your brain isn't sending any electrical signals any faster, the muscles aren't contracting any faster, they're just contracting with more force, which is propelling your body higher quicker. So you no longer take those 4.5 tenths of a second. Now you take 3.5 tenths of a second. So now in every measurable form, your rate of force development improved as a function of you being stronger. It always happens that way. It has to happen that way. That like separating the biology from it, the physics are such. It has to happen that way. The math doesn't work otherwise.
Do you think that there's a point of diminishing returns? I know this is something that we hear a lot about strength and things like that. Is there a point of diminishing returns where it's a lot efficient to continue to increase absolute strength? I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, retirement. When you're done playing, because strength always buys you so much speed. Like the cost of speed is pretty consistent. The problem becomes that again, gravity is 9.81 meters per second squared near Earth. It's that squared, right? So that speed increases. The cost of speed is relatively constant, but you have to buy more speed to overcome gravity faster, because gravity is an exponential speed. It's not a linear speed. So that means that you are only strong enough if you never desire to go faster. You are only strong enough if you never desire to accelerate faster. You're only strong enough if you never desire to decelerate or change directions faster. The stronger you are, the bigger budget you have, basically, to buy up that speed of gravity, to accelerate, decelerate, like the stronger you are, the more force you potentially have to display over shorter and shorter periods of ground contact.
So
So if
this,
Usain Bolt was relatively stronger, he would have run faster. The only reason he didn't run faster, absent of his own intention or work habits or something, but the functional reason why 9.5 8 is where it stopped is because when he got to 27 point, I think it's 27.6 miles per hour, the ground contacts were so fast, he was not strong enough to purchase a 1,000th of a second faster ground contact. If he could have, we'd be talking about, the 9.54 100 or the
so strength is
9.49 100.
currency. Strength is
Strength
essentially
is
currency.
currency. Strength is
Love it.
currency. So if you have nothing else you desire to purchase athletically, then you are strong enough.
Mm.
If you're dead, you're strong enough.
Mm-hmm.
If you're still alive, kicking, competing, you probably want to have more strength.
So something that I've heard, and I know that we've had conversations on this, and I actually have some, coaches that are, close to me and have mentioned this is the Matt Rhea studies, right?
Yeah.
The Matt Rhea study where he looked at the squat relative to their strength ratio at Alabama versus I believe Indiana. And he found that 1.7 times body weight seemed to be the optimal strength ratio for his fastest guys. What's your take on that number? We hear it thrown on around a lot, but I don't hear a lot of people making sense of it.
So when he got to the NFL, he found that the number necessary was even lower. Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah. So as the nature of the athlete got higher, and what's there's plenty of guys who are as strong as the athletes in the NFL. That's not actually rare. What is rare is that athletes have that level of relative strength in combination with elasticity. The difference between a no-star kid and a five-star kid is typically that the five-star kid interacts with the ground much faster. For their size, they interact with the ground faster. It's almost always the difference. They are a combination of strong, explosive, and elastic. Elasticity being the hardest of the traits to build, the longest sort of on-ramp to build. Again, because of lifestyle factors and kids' histories. Like there's a reason why it kind of doesn't matter where you look on Earth. The highest concentrations of the most elastic athletes come from generally impoverished backgrounds. They don't come from the iPad kids, right? They come from the kids that get out and play in the street.
Yeah.
Go look at Brazil, the favelas. It's not the kids who go out and play out in the fields where they have plenty of, space and soft ground. It's the kids who play in compressed areas with lots of competition on asphalt, on compacted dirt. It's the kids who, get the most ground contacts of high intensities, changing directions a lot, accelerating a lot. And those same kids become the kids who are faster. So the most elastic kids are the most coveted. So in the NFL, you've got a higher proportion of self-selected, elastic athletes. They're just trying to get the best football players, but it turns out, and the same thing holds true for basically every sport. The more elastic kids at the greater sizes are the most coveted kids. So those kids, in the NFL, you've got 53 NFL players. 53 players who, by and large, are almost to a man model athletes, they're much more likely to be significantly more elastic, right? So again, the squat is the hip and the knee. The elasticity is the foot, the ankle, the lower limb. What is the foot and the ankle and the lower limb doing during a squat? It's being cradled in a shoe. You don't know what it is,
Right.
right? So you got 53 NFL players, and it turns out, oh, wow, when you have 53 relatively elastic athletes, they don't have to be as strong at the hip and knee to do the same things. And then you go down a level, you go, all right, Alabama, they're about as close as you can get to the NFL without being the NFL. And their ratio is very similar. Strange how that happens. You know, in both of these cases, these athletes are by and large taller and longer, right? The Saints players are taller and longer than the Alabama players. And now you see a gigantic drop off in the level of athlete recruited and the height and length of those players going from Alabama down to Indiana. So you have
Yep.
athletes who are more reminiscent of what you're likely to see in high school. They're still like, a selection of the best high school players, but now you've got athletes who are not on average by a significant margin, not as elastic. And so it turns out these less elastic kids need higher strength levels to run the same times and be as productive on the field. So strength will take a less elastic kid and make him perform like a more elastic kid, make him at least appear in a testing setting to be a similar type of person.
Right.
And let's run that on down to what if you were at, let's say, like FAMU, an HBCU lower level D1 that's here in Tallahassee. We've got FSU, a top 25, D1 like powerhouse and a still power conference versus a team that is in, a lesser conference and nearly a full division down. Far less elastic kids. Now go, and you can see that borne out in like their average track times. Go look at the average track times of the higher recruited classes. They are lower. Those kids are faster. They're bigger, they're taller, they're faster. And now also with a bigger, taller like you start getting into the proportions and everything. A longer athlete, a 5'3" athlete versus a 6'3" athlete. If they weigh the same, their levers are totally different.
Yeah.
So that 6'3" athlete is not going to need to be as strong as the 5'3" athlete, right?
Yeah.
So we start getting into all those things. All of these things actually lead me to the conclusion of the lower level you are working with, like unless you're working with pre-selected NFL type players, you should be seeking to drive up those ratios even higher. But beyond all of that, if you're looking at, say, one of my kids, where we do a ton of lower limb stuff, and then you're looking at a kid down the street, my kid is going to need less strength on a squat. On average, my kids are going to need less strength on the squat to run the same time. Why? Because there is a pretty high likelihood that if you go anywhere else around town, they're not doing something, daily or weekly for their lower limb. They probably are squatting, power cleaning, maybe they're deadlifting. They're probably not doing near the volume of sled work. They probably aren't doing hurdle hops the same way. They aren't doing all the things to address the elasticity. So all that is to also say, you can only compare those ratios to kids trained in the same style, because you can't compare a kid with trained feet to a kid with untrained feet. That is the equivalent of comparing, how much, if you have a kid who trained his way into a 10,500 and a kid who hopped off the couch said, I'd like to try track, and he ran a 10,500, One of those kids had to work past his genetics to get there and is there as a result of regimented work. The other one is there as a result of, God-given ability. That
Right.
one with the God-given ability who's never done a squat in the rack before, I'm pretty sure he's going to have trouble on an ass to grass squat, a movement he's never done.
Yeah.
Beyond that, he's going to go, I already do this. Beyond that, if you want to start getting into it, when you get up to the NFL level, most of these guys have private trainers that train them 3/4 of the year.
Right.
And if they don't want to do the team stuff, then they don't.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's a totally different environment. You're not
Yeah.
you're not comparing apples to oranges.
Yeah.
You are comparing, it's like comparing a grocery store to a Chick-fil-A on a Sunday. Like one just isn't open. Like you can't even measure what's really inside. You don't
Right.
it's not even open for business.
Yeah.
They're not trying.
I looked into this same kind of thing when people would cite the Matt Reyes studies, and I know you've mentioned this, you just mentioned this, but the you saw that the relative strength ratio was kind of less as you went up the tiers. I know he said 1.7 for Bama. I think it was 1.9 for Indiana, and I know when he was at IMG with Baloo, I believe it was over 2. So
Yeah.
um, I guess we see coaches oftentimes use that as kind of like a reasoning on why they don't have to make them strong because the higher level athletes aren't as strong. Whereas you're looking at completely differently, where if we want to get our athletes to that higher level, we have to leverage strength at such a greater degree than the athletes that are the most gifted. And I think that's really interesting. And I'm sure that coaches that, the Twitter coaches that are on there that are just spewing BS numbers aren't going to like that. But I'm glad that you said that you kind of brought some light to that.
It's it's simple, like it's simple game theory in economics. If I'm short and I don't have a job and I want to go on a date with an attractive, well sought after woman, I better have a shining personality. I can't be ugly, broke, I can't be ugly, broke, short, overweight. Like I can't have everything going against me.
Right.
Like I can't measure what it will take for me and what it takes for Brad Pitt and go, oh, well, that's the cutoff point for Brad Pitt. So I don't have to do anything more. I don't have the award nominations. I don't have the money. I wasn't on people's, sexiest issues or whatever. People don't know my name. So I have to eclipse significantly whatever effort he has to do. Right? Like that's the way that you should look at it. It's well, it costs him $1, but you have negative $37 in your bank account. That means it costs you $38 because you have to get back to where he is and then pay.
Right.
Like he started, it costs Tyreek Hill nothing to attend a Miami Dolphins game. That
Right.
doesn't mean that the cost is free. That
Right.
means I'm not Tyreek Hill. I got to go pay a ticket.
So
Like,
yeah. No, that's a really good really good point on that. Something I did want to talk to you about. We know you made the movie. We know you've been around West Side. That you're very intelligent, obviously, and you have a different perspective on things because you were kind of watching. We were kind of watching while you were there. You were inside. You had an outside view on some of the things that were happening. What do you think most people get wrong when it comes to the translation of West Side? Like what are people getting wrong on the training? Where we kind of went wrong in this translation of what was actually happening West Side versus what people think was happening at West Side?
um, well, I mean, just to be honest, like the first thing that people get wrong is that they've never read the book or watched the tape, and they don't actually know what West Side is. So that's the first thing is they formed an opinion before they had any um, basis of information on which to do that. Um, so then, assuming that you read the books,
Are you telling me they just read an
uh,
article on on Juggernaut and formed their opinion?
yeah,
Tell me that? Okay.
yeah. I doubt, for most people, I doubt that they read anything. Like even the article that they read, like the headline.
Yeah.
They might have read a caption under a picture,
Sometimes they
but
brag about not reading anything on Twitter.
yeah. But so a big thing is like, I am in my other like part of my career, as a documentary filmmaker, I am obsessed with story. Okay. I said this to some coaches at a seminar in Atlanta a few years ago. I was asked like, how did you go from documentaries to coaching? And I said, training, because I trained first. I was an athlete first. My dad was my coach when I was very young. My dad was an athlete long before that. A story is simply reconciling the passage of time and the effect of that passage of time. Training is, in essence, the exact same thing. Training and coaching. Training is using the passage of time in context to your advantage, right? It's leveraging the opportunity of time and reconciling the effects of it on the same, on a character. That's what a story is. So to understand training, you have to understand, person goes and trains, time passes, the training has this effect, it has this, and they end up over here as hopefully, the bigger, stronger, more advanced athlete. And if you don't reconcile that training correctly, they do not end up as the bigger, stronger athlete. If you don't reconcile the story correctly, not to toot my own horn, but I'll do it, because I went to enough screenings of West Side versus the World when I took it around the country and around the world. Um, there's a lot of, when the door comes down and Louis saying, like all my life is in this gym. Every player, every athlete, every lifter is a brick in the wall of West Side Barbell, and then that door comes down and there's an eerie silence. I saw a lot of misty eyes in a lot of different cities. In at least 3 different countries, I saw people cry at that movie. That's because I was able to reconcile time and the formula of going from, like A to Z.
Right.
I was able to line everything up to create the adaptation that I wanted, which was for you to feel something in response to it. And to feel, because again, this movie came out in 2018, to feel that this man, Louis Simmons, who had done so much, was sort of at the end of his journey. And to, without saying it, the door comes down and it's supposed to instill upon you the idea that you are watching a man in his last years, right? It implies his death without saying it outright. And deep down, some part of you goes, oh my God, like this is all ending, right? If I don't line that up, it ends and you go like, what the hell was that?
Yeah.
Like I have to earn that ending. You
Right.
have to earn your results in training by reconciling the passage of time, reconciling events for their adaptations. It's the same. To me, these things are the same. So when people look at West Side, I think that this is the problem with all kinds of training. Look at it as a journey of a person to get from A to Z. Louis was a power lifter. He had hit, when he says, in the very beginning of the movie, like, I was an Olympic lifter. And he said, like in ninth grade, I weighed, this, and I squatted 400 pounds. And I clean and jerked 245. And then in 12th grade, I clean and jerked 265 and I squatted 410 pounds. That in itself is a story that has a lot of meaning. Just that simple, I was here and I did this. I clean and jerked this and I squatted this. 4 years passed and I clean and jerked 20 more pounds and I only squatted 10 more pounds. There's a whole story there. He's saying for 4 years I toiled away at this pursuit, going clean and jerk, like as my emphasis, clean and jerk and snatch, going Olympic lifts as the main driver. And very quickly I got up into that low 200s. And then it took 4 years for me to add 20 pounds to that simple lift. And in the meanwhile, how much did my squat raise? 10 pounds. And he got heavier as well. So he gained more than 10 pounds of body weight, and his squat didn't even keep up.
Right.
And he's looking at that in disgust and saying, something is wrong here because I'm barely improving at all. And if you've worked in a high school realm and you've seen, like, it's pretty easy to get a kid to clean, 200 pounds. But in the same weight room where it seems like every kid gets to 200 pounds almost immediately, all the freshmen are cleaning 200 pounds. And then you look to the other side of the room and you go, what are our seniors doing? I don't see 3 plates on a bar yet. Like, how did I get them to 200 so fast? And then I couldn't progress them 25 more pounds a year? That's not an ambitious goal. The problem is you're using the clean itself as the driver. And what does the clean become limited by? The squat, the deadlift. They don't have the strength to continue progressing the clean. So when Louis telling that story, he is laying out all of these other things that, just for economy of words, and because he, was like, in the nicest way possible, like, if, in another life, in another time, like, Louis could have been a troll under a bridge who told riddles. Just the way that he spoke, like, it was magical. But he had so much fun telling these sort of riddles where he'd say half the idea and he'd look at you, and if you got the idea, like if he saw the light come on in your eyes, like, oh damn, then he'd keep talking to you. And if you didn't, he'd just turn and walk away. And I personally love that because I love putting together puzzles and stuff, and I love the poetic sort of absurdity of it. But with a thing like that, he's saying, I went down this road and I realized I was limited by my lack of relative strength, or in this case, my lack of absolute strength. My clean could not drive my squat past relatively novice numbers. So my clean plateaued and stayed there. And then I went to a powerlifting contest and I saw, damn, all these dudes, he didn't watch any of them power clean, but he watched them all squat 600 and 700 pounds. And he goes, holy shit. Like, these are the strong guys, because he had seen tons of people power clean in Columbus, Ohio. He had seen that. He trained at a gym that was Olympic lifters.
Right.
That's where he went after school. That's where he went when he got kicked out of school. Like, so he had already seen people who that was their passion, and he watched them all run into the same brick wall over and over again. And he just thought, well, that's the game. You run into that brick wall and you hope that one day it falls over before you do. Either you collapse the wall or you fall down dead. That's our options. No internet back then, so that's what he thought. And then he sees, oh crap, there's these people over here who are figuring something out. They've managed to get insanely strong. And I'm sure that the other part of that in his head is, man, because he started with the clean and jerk, started with the snatch. How much more would I be cleaning if I could squat 700 pounds? I can't clean 300 and I can barely squat 400. Super common problem. But I don't know how to squat 500. I don't know how to get there. These guys have figured out how to get there. So, I'll follow them. And he followed them and he got on very good. And then he ran into another problem. He didn't know how to balance the fatigue and the strain of it. He didn't, he had to lift in a certain way to develop those attributes, but now there was a lot of fallout to that way of lifting. And boom, he gets injured. And then he invents the reverse hyper. Not a novel idea, but his execution of his execution of the device is his invention. And he fixes his back, and boom, he's back at it, baby. Only to fall victim to the same chronic stress and fatigue, the same structural breakdowns. And then he realizes, oh, the exercise will get me back, but my system of training is what's breaking me down. Okay, I gotta figure out a new way to train. And so what did he look at? Track and field. So when people start, oh, well, that doesn't work, and this, like, no. Look at where he took it from. Track and field. If something is true, it's true all the time. If it's true over here, it's true over there. If it's true over there, but it's untrue over here when we call it something different, then we're misunderstanding some connection. Because when things are true, they're true all the time. That's why physics and science are valuable, is because they are just the reconciliation of the consistency of math out in the world. So he looks at, he had already begun experimenting with Bulgarians in like the late 70s. And then that leads him to get even stronger, even faster. He's feeling good, but he gets hurt again. So now he's got to figure out, how do I train with some submaximal element? And now he starts reading about the Soviets and reading about Verkhoshansky and everybody, and it starts like reading about these ideas of how speed plays a role in developing special strengths. And where is all this coming from? It's coming from Soviet track and field. It's coming from East German shot putters. So he took their concepts, that like there's not a track coach on earth who would say, don't look at track speed training if you want to get faster. Right? But Louis looks at track periodizations and track ideas and applies them to his work, and everyone goes, whoa, that's dangerous. Stay away from there. Like, no, dudes, follow the story. He's doing the same thing that you all romanticize in theory all the time.
Right.
He just went out and did it. And it's so true that it was so successful that you no longer associate him with his story. You associate him with results of the story. Like people don't know about like Butch Reynolds. People don't know about Kevin Randleman. People don't know about Mo Robinson. Like 2 400-meter gold medalists between 1996 and 2000 or 2004 trained at Westside Barbell. And the gold medalists in the 400, that's not a powerlifting event.
No.
That's not, that's a long sprint.
Right.
That's not even a pure max velocity event.
Right.
Like, that's a pretty complex,
yeah,
antithetical to the idea, and everyone goes, oh, those big fat powerlifters. Go look at Chuck Vogelpohl, shirt off with the pit bull.
With the pit bull walking.
He looks like a linebacker.
Right.
He looks, like Luke Kuechly would have died for that body. Like, these dudes, and people go like, well, if they're so great, wouldn't they be in the NFL? No, because they're 5'7".
Right.
Well, I'm friends with Dave Hoff. I love Dave. Dave is very short. Like, and he could still jump up on those high boxes and stuff.
Yeah.
Amazing, feats of athleticism. Go look at like old Greg Panora and like, go look at those guys. Those guys are athletes.
Yeah.
With very rare exception. I mean, there were guys way back when it was basically just a hardcore biker gym with weights, like, guys like Tilt, who weighed like 500 pounds and were in horrible shape. But generally, the actual good lifters are Dave Hoff, when he totaled 3103, I've got the video. It will be in the next documentary in 4K for everyone to see. He has giant abs. He has like a damn, like 8-pack. it just is in this really weird shape because it's got all this other muscle underneath it.
Right.
But you know, if you've ever wondered, like, what would one of those like big Gatorade coolers look like if it had abs? Like that was Dave Hoff squatting 1273.
Right.
But the point is, like, you go back and you look at, you know, where do the bands come from? Where do the chains come from? Where do the weight releasers come from? Where do the box jumps come from? Where do sleds come from? Prowlers, all this stuff. Uh, calf ham glutes or glute ham developers, whatever you want to call them. You know, like everything comes from the same lineage that they come from, and it bears out over and over and over and over again
Yeah.
because it's the reconciliation of physics and math that none of it was invented by Louis. It was just applied there.
Right.
And within the movie, even, you know, like the third act of the movie, you know, it starts with where the movie really comes in for a landing. I haven't watched this movie since 20, maybe or December 2018. I took this movie to, you know, film festivals and stuff, and when they would hit play, I'd walk out of the room and go sit in the lobby. But I still remember all the stuff because I watched it thousands of times over.
Right.
But like Dave Tate saying, you know, Louis had started to transition to all these other sports. Dave Tate, go watch any interview when he talks about West Side. He'll always say, I don't talk about the things that happened after I left. Dave left in like 2004, 2003.
Yeah.
So he's saying in the last years, meaning the late 90s on, meaning from when the Bulls came by, meaning from when, you know, the Seahawks and the Packers and, you know, Kent Johnston and all those guys and Buddy Morris and Bill Gillespie and Joey Batson and, you know, long before Pete Prinzi was there, again, when Kevin Randleman, Stipe, Matt Brown, you know, Mark Coleman coming in, like, it was, you know, he was already shifting his focus over into sports. And so everyone loves like the children of West Side, but that name scares them for some reason. And mostly it's because, I don't know, they look at 5'5", you know, 60-something-year-old Louis covered in tattoos, and they go, oh, that fat little man. And again, the same thing where you go like, dude, he was lean. You know, Louis used to always do a thing. He tells, I have all these stories of people talking about, like, you know, someone would come in and call Louis fat, and he'd say like, yeah, I gained a few pounds. And he kind of, you know, grab some of his belly like that, and then he'd say, yeah, feel that. And they go to, you know, press his belly fat, and he'd grab their hand and go, no, really get in there. And he would relax as much as he could. So they'd get way up in, you know, they're just pressing into muscle. And then he would flex and break their finger and then cuss them out, and, you know, violence might ensue and they'd leave. But like, knowing the story of how it developed, and this is with any training, understand the story of why they set up their training that way. Was it a time constraint? Was it an equipment constraint? How old was their athlete? You know, like, if you're looking at, if you're training a 14-year-old, don't try and train them to the letter of that 4-day-a-week West Side template. Don't try and take the template from Dave Tate and Elite FTS and apply it verbatim. Understand that your kid has next to no understanding of how just things in the weight room work. So he's not going to adapt as fast. He needs more repetition because he has to learn what it is that he's trying to do. Louis' guys didn't have to learn. They knew full what they were 100% aware of what they were trying to do. And that most of them, either they started with Louis then when they were like 14, and then when they were like 19, like Kenny Patterson or Dave Hoff, then they started to really blossom.
Right.
He had like a 5-year on ramp. He would, you know, Louis would get a guy in day one, and, you know, tell Bob Youngs, for example, who's coming to train with Dave Tate, I'll let you do the first exercise, and then you're going to do one accessory and leave. It's like, what the hell, man? I came all this way to, and he goes, no, no, no. You're going to get stronger from the one thing, but you can't keep up with Dave. You can't keep up with me. You can't keep up with Chuck. They're going to bury you, and not in like a crush your ego way. They're going to try and crush your soul. They'll try
Right.
and put you in the hospital, but they'll crush you to a point where you don't get any stronger. You can't get there tomorrow. It's a long building process. You
Right.
have to understand cognitively what you're doing, which is another thing. Like, you go to West Side and, I'd watch like Jason Coker bench. And every week you go, man, I hit a PR today. What did you hit a PR in? Oh, I hit a PR in, 2 fingers on the smooth, close grip with a pause. And then the next week you go, oh, I hit a PR today. And he'd say like the same weight. And you'd be like, really? What'd you hit a PR in today? Oh, 1 finger outside the smooth, medium grip with a 1 second pause. And you go like, where, to the average person watching, they'd be like, why is he benching again? I thought they changed it every week. He's so advanced, it might be a 40 or 50 pound like difference between moving in and out a finger or two.
Right.
And then you'd see like, yeah, I'm taking a wide grip, and he'd go. And again, to like my kids, like, they might go, and
Yeah.
I'm having to tell them like, no, 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 line up on where the smooth and the neural meet. Okay, now we're progressing to a thumb's width. Okay, like I'm having to anchor them into a very specific spot because they don't have any frame of reference.
Right.
Yeah, I did a seminar, well, not really a seminar, but at the Arnold one year, Louis had, a ton of people down in the gym, and he said, come down here. I want you to talk to them about what we were talking about the other day. And so we went down, and we're in West Side, and there's all these people, and there's this Olympic lifter who is pestering Louis about specificity. And he goes, Mike, tell him what we talked about the other day. And I was like, and he goes, the basketball thing. And I go, oh. And I said, well, the idea of specificity, I said, specificity doesn't actually exist, right? Specificity is a kind of in the eye of the beholder thing. Specificity to you and variation to me might be the exact same thing. Because if you're not sensitive to understand the difference in stimulus, if you haven't developed, if you don't have a feedback mechanism to highlight to you what the differences are, then your brain might never catalog the differences. It might always interpret them as the exact same thing. This is why when you get up into really high reps and stuff, you fatigue and you get hurt because you can't feel when you're starting to get out of position. And a guy like Dave Hoff or a guy like Ed Cohn, why they're superior lifters, or say Laura Phelps, is because they're far more sensitive. And he wasn't getting it. And I said, so it's like this. If you go out and you shoot a basketball, I'm going to say, what do you aim for? And you're probably going to be like me, where maybe you played like JV basketball, but you weren't good. So you're going to say, oh, I try and shoot it just over the rim. That's cool. Someone once asked, Steph Curry, what do you aim for? And now Steph Curry is renowned for his exceptionally quick release. He shoots very well off the move, off the dribble, off of screens. He catches, shoots. He's always having to find the basket and in a hurry make an adjustment. Steph Curry said, oh, I look for the front of the rim. I'll look for 3 rungs holding the net. And I aim to put it just over the center of the middle rung. In 2 to 3/10 of a second, he identifies 3 rungs on the same rim. You say, I just try and put it over the front of the rim. And Steph Curry looks at that and says, well, which rung of the rim? Those are different to him.
Yeah.
Do I try and put it a little to the left or the right? If a guy's like, I got to put just a little more touch on it, it's got to come off of a different finger. Like, there's all of this detail and nuance to how he does it. He can interpret each one of those things as a different data point, as a different stimulus. His mind can actually bring it in and make sense of it. And he can make that decision and make those adjustments, mid-stroke of the ball. But for me, I'm just trying to generally be in line with a vague idea of the center of the front of the rim.
Right.
So that if I miss this way, I've got half a basketball's width. And if I miss this way, I've got half a basketball's width. And Steph Curry is going, no, no, no. I'm looking for an area that big to gently place the ball over. So when he misses here and he misses here. And when I miss over here and over there.
Right.
I weep on everything. He still makes it, and just like like Larry Bird, there were plenty of stories that way too, where he would miss or he would make a free throw and he'd be pissed about it because it didn't sound right. And he'd know, like, no, 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 I shot that too deep into the net, or I shot it too shallow, too much to the right, too much to the it wasn't perfect. But he could sense the difference between perfect and imperfect. Coker can sense the difference between his fingers being a quarter of an inch in either direction. He's that attuned to it. So his idea of variation is almost imperceptible to, a
To a
novice
normal,
lifter
yeah,
without
to a normal
information.
lifter. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like when I have my kids board press, I took out 3 boards. So 3 boards too close to the 2 and the 4. I need those variations to be similar but distinct.
Yeah.
So doing a board press, it's very similar to a bench press. So my kids don't have a learning curve with it. But doing a 4 board, they identify as that is a completely different lift than going to your chest. Doing a 2 board, I introduce that later, and it has to be a big enough difference in order for them to like feel how different it is. Otherwise, the 2 board is too close to the chest and too close to the 4.
Yeah.
So from kind of those standpoints, and again, if you look back through the history of West Side, they used to repeat a max effort for 3 weeks in a row. Then they started repeating for 2 weeks in a row. Then they started changing every week. But the age of their lifters got higher. The training age of their lifters got higher. The strength levels got higher. So it's always the same math, but people are really bad at acknowledging where they're starting from. I guess that's what I'm getting at.
Right.
You have to acknowledge where you're at and apply the math accordingly, which means you're not going to get to the advanced stuff for a long time, maybe never. You don't need it, and then everything that you do apply, you can't apply mindlessly because they are all small things. The same way you said, like earlier, like I have a holistic system. Each thing is, why are we doing Nordics? To prevent, to provide power for the hamstring at the knee, but also to prevent injuries at the knee. Why
Yeah.
are we doing the back raises then? Well, because where do most hamstrings pull? They pull when that foot hits directly underneath you, and all of a sudden those reaction forces spike up through your, the top half of your hamstring into your glute. Why are we doing reverse hypers after we squat? To decompress you from the squat. Like none of these things exist just in a vacuum.
Right.
There's not a righteous order. It's we're reconciling the math in accordance to the time of wherever the kid is at.
Yeah. Yeah, you can especially see that in kind of towards like right before Louis passed away. You kind of saw their pendulum swinging back on the dynamic effort, then moving more to the 5x5. And I know he said that the lifter was just different now. They needed a little bit more size. Maybe they were lazy, or however Louis phrased that. I'm sure he phrased it a few different ways, but ultimately he came back to something. Yeah. So ultimately he came back to the same thing: was my lifters need to get bigger. They need to be what they used to be. And he was getting lifters that weren't as high level, or maybe didn't have as much training age as like Chuck did, because he had Chuck from a young age. So they needed to kind of go back to some of the more basic stuff so they could get back to the doubles and triples. And I think that, we both see that problem, like with the speed work for our own kids, is they don't really have that concept of like pushing the bar really fast yet. So you had to give them a little bit more heavier weight so they can learn how to push hard. And then eventually it clicks where they know how to push in sub maximal weights. And that's just something that you learn a little bit more over time. So I think that's a really good point on like the translation, I guess, of West Side and kind of where people are starting to fall. They're taking a template or a program that was, 2 decades in versus, what Louis initially did with the lifters when he first got them. So
Yeah.
good point on that.
Well,
Something I want to chat with you about.
now they're selling things that now they're selling things and they're coming to conclusions that Louis was doing in like 1983.
Yeah.
Right? Like one guy's selling 1983 West Side and he's railing against West Side. And then another guy's selling 1987 West Side and he's railing against West Side. Neither of these people know that what they're selling is just old West Side because they never read a Powerlifting
Are
USA.
you sure they didn't come up with clusters and high rep sets out or high sets and low reps on their own? Are you sure that's not original?
Yeah.
Oh,
8x3 and 12x2, 15x1, 24x1.
I thought that
You
was
know,
recent. I thought that was all just new.
those are all recent. That's not what we did when I was a
Started,
child in my garage in the monolift.
yeah,
Um,
established in 2022 by a lifter or a coach
yeah,
who's under 30.
yeah.
Um,
But yeah, so you have that where it's like that Goodwill Hunting scene where like Matt Damon's saying like, oh, let me guess, you're on this, and then you're gonna be on that until next year when you're on this. And it all goes like that, and then it ends with until start taking up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu more and more seriously.
See, I've also noticed that as well. Like watching the evolution of like strength conditioning coaches on Twitter, like young coaches. I'm a young coach, but watching the evolution of like
Mhm.
2 years ago they bashed Conjugate and they bashed strength and it didn't, you know what I mean? And then now we're starting to see this thing switch. We're like, oh well, we need to get them stronger to this, and they're starting to kind of transition more to what we were already doing a couple of years ago. And so
Mhm.
it's like that natural evolution of like if you pay attention, you end up to where where we're at, where Jared's at, where Louis at, you know what I mean? Like if you pay attention, you end up there, but there's a lot of coaches that just don't see it yet. And it just takes time, or they get out of the profession before they ever get to that point. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's kind of a good point. A lot of the hate and things are in 5 years from now, the things that you do now are going to be popular. It takes them a
yeah,
cycle to understand it.
yeah. Well, it's the like conjugate is conjugate is not an easy sell
Right.
because it is not actually like a system. Like it's not actually a template. It is a systemized way of thinking.
Yeah.
It's again, it is like it's a toolbox. It's a toolbox of ways to to reconcile problems. That's all it is a response to ever evolving problems. So no, like it's so weird because people will be, like people will rail against conjugate and you go like, all conjugate is like a means to an end, guys. It's just like Louis wasn't out there saying like, oh, we've got to do anything conjugate. No, Louis would drink motor oil. It like if Louis could drink a magic potion and then his board would have changed if his guys all went home and the gym stayed completely empty and they just went to powerlifting meets and the records fell. Then Louis would have drank a magic potion and told everyone to stop lifting weights.
Yeah.
Conjugate was just the result of the journey.
Right. Of
Like,
solving those problems.
yeah, it's like no one along the way had it's and because it's an acknowledgement of problems as they happen and problems that are often like so individual, it's not a good thing to sell,
Right.
right? Like when you sell a program, you want it to be like, hey, this program works. This will work for
Yeah.
you.
It's
Conjugate's like, yeah,
yeah.
we're gonna see what happens to you, and then we're gonna solve it.
That's the
Like,
problem I ran into. And I know you've told me this before. People want like they want to buy programs off you, buy templates. Like I have people that DM me like, can you send me a program or a template of this, and that? I'm like, I literally cannot give you what I do because it's not what your kids need or what you need. I need to actually see you
yeah,
do stuff before I can adjust it.
yeah. I'm always like, like I don't do online training.
Yeah.
I don't do any online coaching. Everything is in person, and again, like I understand I'm lucky in a bunch of ways that I have multiple income streams that are allow me to do that. But one of the things is I tell people all the time, like, I'll hop on the phone with you though. If I have any open time, I will give it to you.
Yeah.
You tell me what you do, and I'll tell you, you tell me what you do and what is causing you to think that you need a change. And then I'll tell you what I would try. And I'll
Right.
tell you why. Like, I'll give you logic. I'll give you it. I would feel weird charging you for programming because I'm like, I don't know what equipment you have. I don't know what problems you have. So I'm going to send you out there to go,
Yeah.
wreck something and come back to me and go, okay, now it's broken. What do I fix? Like, how do I
Right.
do it? Like, just tell me what your problem is, and we'll work backwards from that, and we'll try and
Right.
balance it all out. And hopefully you see that happen a couple times and you go, oh, that's just the system of
Yeah.
this is the system of checks and balances. And now you can apply it for yourself and there's no money exchanged. And
Yeah.
you're smarter for it. And I have a solution to a problem I didn't have from it.
Something that I found a lot of value in, like learning things, is like just logs of people's training. I know Jared has like you've looked at Jared's logs and like his jump
Mhm.
logs, and like Louis put like logs of people's training. He put little articles, people would explain their training and stuff in there. Like I think that's probably one of the best. But instead of giving someone like an online training program, which you can do, I like the idea of, and I've entertained it, of just like giving out logs of my own athletes training and like letting people see it and then putting little like paragraphs in there like, hey, this is why I did this, instead of just giving like, here you go, let's do box squats. Like here's why we're doing that, and here's exactly,
Mhm.
you might not want to do that, but this is why I did, and this is how I do it. I like that. I don't know if I mean it probably wouldn't make any money. A lot of the good stuff seems to not make any money, but that would be like some. I know Jared said he's talking about maybe writing another book on brief maximal tension, and like, but he's like, I don't really want to get, that's like the gym stuff. He's like, I don't want to like really put that into something. He's like, because that's what I do with the gym. But he's like, training logs wise, like I'll show you what the logs look like. I'm like, that's what I want to pay for. Is I just want to pay for the
Yeah.
what you actually did. Give it to me so I can just read it, and then I can be like, okay, this is, I'm going to take this and do this.
Yeah. I told Jared a few years ago, like, I think I said, I'll pay you $1,000. Let me come up here and I'll go buy a scanner.
Scan all
And
your
like
logs.
I was like, I'll just show up to the gym. You keep training. I'll just show up to the gym, take your stacks of folders. I'll pay you $1,000 and I'll scan their folders and I'll then like digitize all that and give it back to you. I'll give you the folders back and I'll give you the digital copies back, but I'm going to keep some and
Yeah.
like break the numbers down and basically machine learn it myself.
Yeah.
And he just like laughed at me and was like, no. Um, but I was able to look through the folders and, uh, it was, I did get to spend enough time at the time, but like I went out on the floor a little bit and watched him kind of adjust some people in real time.
Yeah.
But yeah, seeing those patterns of numbers, like that's seeing the patterns of numbers and then asking like, so why did you do this here? That's like the most informative thing to me. And it's also the thing that like no one can tell you when you explain conjugate that way. Um, which again is like just to, like Lou would say all the time too, like it's just training. Like it's just,
Yeah.
he said like the whole world's conjugate. Everything is conjugate. He also said the whole world was West Side. Um, one of my great like regrets of the movie is putting in the trailer, like you don't train West Side unless you're at West Side.
Yeah.
It's new West Side guys that said that. Um, like Lou's like, no, like, Donnie
Everybody's West.
Thompson trained West Side, Paul Childress trained West
Yeah.
Side, all these guys, they all train, you know. Um, and then he'd say, yeah, well, half the people in here don't train West Side if we're going by that rule. Um, but yeah, it's just that like when you present it as the athlete had this problem, so we did this in response. No one can argue with you. They can say maybe that wasn't the best answer.
Yeah.
They can say I would have done something different, but they're not going to be able to say like, no, you're a moron. That was stupid. You shouldn't do, like that's wrong. it's just going to be like, I don't agree with that necessarily, but there's always going to be respect to like what the process was,
Right.
because that's all it is. It's just problem solving. Just ever ongoing problem solving.
Right. Something I want to talk to you about before, because we got about 45 minutes before you got
Yeah.
to go. So, something I want to talk to you about is the OVR performance. I know there's certain stuff you can't share on here. I know that I'm gonna make this for like 2 week, not in this coming weekend, maybe next weekend or the following. Um, as far as the VBT go, you've launched that already. Okay, or at least
Uh-huh.
you've put out some things on that. How do you
Uh-huh.
apply VBT in your weight room? Like, what do you? It's a tether, right? It's kind of like a tether in the
Yeah.
box. So, what are you kind of using to track with it? Like, how can a coach, if they took this, what types of things should they do with it? What are some ways? Kind of give us the Michael Fahey application. What are you doing with this technology in your weight room?
Um, so there's a number of things that you can do. You can use it to, you know, put kind of floors on different exercises or put ceilings on it.
Velocity.
That Yeah, velocity floors or ceilings. So,
Yep.
you can say as kids are, let's say they're maxing, you can put it on as a guardrail, in a sense to say, let's say your best benchers are your mature benchers are rarely if ever going to be able to hit something under 0.15, right? And you could then institute that, hey, for one cluster of kids, let's say like my middle schoolers or something, when their velocity gets under, say 0.25, you say we're going to shut it down there,
Yeah.
you know, because you're unlikely to be able to have another jump past it. Um, Likewise on dynamic effort, Louis would always talk about 0.7 to zero point 0.9 being the dynamic effort range, that he wanted his lifters at. Well, one of the early modifications that I made, in talking like with Jared, was realizing that like, so a strong developed lifter is both able to go slower and able to move faster. Their force velocity curve is larger, right? So it goes higher on one end and it falls out lower on the other. A young lifter, they can't move very fast or very slow. They're kind of just in the middle. So taking that 0.7 to zero point 0.9 meters per second and ratcheting it down, depending on how strong that lifter is, ratcheting it down to, maybe 0.4 to 0.6 meters per second. And I use a lot of 3-week waves. So we might be doing, on week 1, which we're also going to time up with like our dumbbell jumps. Maybe that's when we're doing, this is if I'm doing a more of a dynamic effort type series, but maybe we're doing, what weight can we hit at 0.6 meters per second, right? And I think that a lot of people use the VBT sort of wrong in that sense too, because they'll go like, oh, my kid, like, let's say that he was supposed to do 150 pounds on a box squat at 0.6 seconds. Well, the first set, he only got 0.54. And so they'll drop the weight. And the second set, the kid gets the weight or he gets faster, but they don't drop the weight by that much, right? So they go from 150 to 140 and they drop the weight. Well, the kid probably doesn't really feel a difference. Again, going back to, what we said before about like the idea of variation, specificity in a kid's mind, like it's in context to how much they know and what their training age is and how sensitive they are to the weight. So if you take 5 or 10 pounds off the bar, there's a good chance that when that kid unracks it the next set, it effectively feels the exact same. But now the kid goes faster. Did he go faster because you took weight off, or did he just need more warm-ups? Right? So what I would do when we were doing that is, if we we're at 0.6 and the kid's goal weight to beat was 150 pounds, working set 1, he gets, 0.51. We stay on that. Working set 2 at 150, he gets 0.56. We stay on it. Working set 3, he gets 0.58. We stay on it. Fourth set, he should be tired. He should be dead. He's already done 18 reps. Fourth set, he finally hits 0.6 or higher on all reps. Right? Like, because he was able to learn, especially with rate of force development, there's a cognitive element to it. You have to give the kid enough exposures to learn. So using that VBT to drill in more intent, using that VBT to create more competition.
Yeah.
You can also use that VBT as a safeguard. If we were an Olympic lifting program, using that VBT to make sure that either our peak or average velocities were high enough that those Olympic lifts were actually doing something to possibly make us faster, to possibly make us more explosive. Randy Huntington talks all the time about like moving at 2 meters per second peak velocity. Got to be above 2 meters per second. If you dip below 2 meters per second, we're just moving too slow. We're no longer getting faster. We're not getting stronger. We can't do a power clean slow enough to make us stronger. So we better do them fast enough to make us faster. So that's even if you don't agree with my style of lifting. If we were doing, a real explosive block, again, trying to, move a weight well over, 1 meter per second on average. Like, I had a kid a couple years ago. He was an older kid, so we were doing our max effort sort of deadlift rotations with him on one day, and we were doing a dynamic effort rotation with him on another day. And I took him from April of 2021 to April of 2022. He went from squatting 200 pounds with a straight bar to a 12-inch box. He's 6'4", 6'5". He weighed about 190. Wanted to play tight end at the next level. The following year, he squatted 385 pounds plus 300 pounds of band tension at the top on a safety squat bar at 0.67 for a triple, where the slowest rep was 0.67. So what we did there was we used VBT to constrain him with the goal of keeping him just at or just under 0.6. So we would do 12 sets of 2 or 8 sets of 3, those low rep, high sets.
Yeah.
Whatever you ascribe them to, whoever your guru is. For me,
What year was this?
This was 2021, 2022.
So right after that coach made it up.
Yeah, right after that coach started it. And a couple of years after I did it with another athlete. But doing 12 sets of 2, every time this kid would hit 0.6 meters per second. So he did 200 for 1.
Yeah.
So the next week we went down to 150. So 75%, we started from there. And the goal was try and hit your reps at 0.6 meters per second. And so the first set, he was just under it. Again, he didn't have a good gauge of like, what does that even mean? Move it as fast as I can? He has no idea what fast as he can actually feels like. And this is sort of a common thing with a lot of kids. This is where VBT is like incredibly instructional. Most kids don't know what fast as I can feels like. They don't know what that is.
Right.
They don't know. Kids these days don't know what high intensity effort feels like. So they tell you they're trying, and believe them, they are. But they're trying within the bounds of what they know. And what they don't know is how to try.
Right.
So we took him down to 150. And first set, he can't get 0.6. Second set, he goes from like 0.56 to 0.68, like blasts it. And I go, okay, let's go 160. He goes like 0.61. All right, let's try 170. 0.65. Okay. 180. We keep doing this. By the end of the workout, what he had gotten for like 0.3 something the week before as a 1 rep max, he hit like 210 or 215 at 0.6 plus. So was 200 really his max before? No. It was what he knew how to express. And then we micro loaded between sets
You just taught him how to apply the
until,
force he already had.
yeah, we taught him how to apply what was already there.
Yeah.
And then the next week we kept adding, within like 3 weeks, we got to 275.
Isn't that pretty much what rate of force development training really is? We're just teaching them to apply what they already have. It's just teaching. It's like you say,
Yeah.
sharpening. We're just teaching them what they already have.
Yeah. You build something, so
Yeah.
that absolute strength,
Absolute
maximal
strength.
strength component,
Yep.
and then you teach them how to apply.
Yeah.
And they need a lot of exposures to be taught. So, it's a lot of jumps, it's a lot of
Yeah.
throws. But so what would happen, and when we get them away from the VBT allows us to get away from percentages
Yeah.
as well. Percentages, when you think about it, like the percentages as commonly used in all like West Side derivatives, percentages come from an idea from the Soviets of percentages. The Soviets knew from looking at, lots of logs from lots of different lifters. They knew that lifters were able to complete certain reps and largely this is with Olympic lifts. They knew that they could complete certain reps at certain percentages, right? But they also knew that strength was, that speed was such a pivotal component of strength. The percentages were, in the beginning, they were representative of the idea of speeds. What they wanted was to catalog it by speed. They just didn't have the technology and they didn't have those
So they use
resources
percentages.
logistically.
Yeah.
So they use percentages as essentially a proxy.
Yeah.
So
Guideline.
when
Yeah.
we talk about percentage training and velocity-based training, they are the same thing. They're just spoken in two different languages. One is, the percentages are more rigid, and more sort of estimated
Yeah.
because they're missing data.
Yeah.
Right? Like they didn't know how well those weights were moving. They just know that they were successfully moved.
Right.
But when you start to replace that with velocity, now suddenly you have like an individualized way of using these tools with every kid within the same day, within the same moment. And
Yeah.
you can use that to teach them. So with this kid, we started doing that. If he broke the speed, we would add 5 to 10 pounds. If he broke it significantly, like he popped a 0.7 something, we were definitely adding 10. If he popped 0.8, we're definitely adding 20. Because what we're trying to do is create enough tension. But you could do it in different ways. You could see, let's go and see how fast you can move a given load. Right? Which if the load is sort of correct, it's like a dumbbell jump, right? That's all a dumbbell jump is. We're going to have a fixed load, and now you jump as high as you can with it.
Yeah.
To jump higher, you got to move faster with it. So it's just taking that dumbbell jump idea and bringing it back to a squat. So now you could, it's like the NHL, they do their bench test with 135, which I think is way too high of a number. I use a bench test and it's just a 45-pound bar. So I have my kids go down, pause. I say 3, 2, 1, up, and then they blow it up. And from there, I've had one kid go over 2 meters per second. He's not a high schooler. He's a kid that I used to train. But we use it as, and that for me, that's like explicitly kind of like a test. But it's similar to that idea of like the Powerball throw. Because we used to do
Yeah.
a ton of Powerball throws at Leon because we had space. I get to Florida High, I don't have the same kind of indoor space.
Right.
And, I can't set up a Powerball station that's just there all the time. So I was looking at other things that we could do that kind of gave the same measurement. Well, Powerball is throwing a 6-pound ball. A shot put in high school is, 12 pounds. In the Olympics, it's 16. So seeing how fast they could move that empty bar is the thing that my girls, for the most part, my middle school girls can do. My middle school boys can almost 100% of the time do. My high school, both male and female, can almost 100% of the time do right off the bat. And then I've looked at the correlations with those as well. The R squared number is 0.854, and then continuing on. It's a pretty statistically significant number. So to say that essentially the change in rate of force development, to say that your absolute strength is basically responsible for 85% of your rate of force development increases. It's really damn high.
Yeah.
And the good news is it's really high. It's really easy to, raise that absolute strength ability.
Yeah.
But so I'll test my kids that way. I found that my best pitchers, my best hitters by batting average are all the kids who move the bar the fastest. I asked my coach, just tell me, tell my baseball coach, tell me which kids, who are the best kids on your team? And they're all at the top of that list. I went to my wrestling coach, did the same thing. Now it was a lot easier. But when you start to sort of like constrain it a little bit for weight class, by far the best number from, our older wrestlers was the kid who won states.
Right.
He was also the kid who jumped the highest. He was also the kid who, he wasn't our best box squatter just on absolute strength, but he out jumped. I had two kids who did similar numbers, but one stood out in the vertical and in the velo bench. And the other was a significant, step below in both. He was slightly ahead in terms of absolute strength, but he was significantly behind.
Yeah.
And one of them was, a regional placer and was very good, but ultimately not a state placer. And the other was a state champion. So state champion excelled.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's kind of some of the ways that we do it.
Okay.
You can monitor fall off. Mostly what I do is to provide a goal and then try and micro adjust to hit the goal. As soon as you've hit it, we move past it.
Yeah.
Right. And the weaker the kid is, the pendulum of their prescribed weights is going to be a slower speed. The stronger they are, the bigger their force velocity curve is. We're going, the more fatigue they can inflict upon themselves, the more damage they can do themselves. The offset for that, like say Dave Hoff would use a lighter percentage on his speed work, was because his, moving the same percentages at the same percentages will yield similar speeds. But he's already squatting 1,200 plus pounds, so him moving, say, 1,000 or 1,050 of that, or 1,100, is going to induce a lot more fatigue on him than the other guy who's 1,000-pound squatter moving 750. So he would bring his percentages down in order to bring his speed up.
Yep.
Because max effort day is also a slower grunt, it's a bigger and slower stimulus. So it allows you to balance out all of these things. But the big thing for most people is it allows you to almost have, not so much to like have another coach, but to really gamify the exercise.
Right.
So, to have, you can do it, pick a percentage and then see who moves their percentage fastest. Like if you're a percent-based program, that's how I would use it. Pick a
Right.
percentage, and then say who on the rack. We all have the same percentage. We're all
Right.
lifting 80%. Now
But who's the
there's,
fastest?
like I just said, there's some group your kids by relative strength level.
Yeah.
But so now you got all your 225 benchers on the same bench. They all bench 225, and now you're seeing who moves 80% faster.
Yeah.
And the one who, that's the king of the rack. And then you've got your other rack over here with your 135 benchers. And
Right.
they're the thing, like, so you can instill competition that way, and you can set speed markers that are going to be fast enough that they've got to be pretty efficient reps
Yeah.
when you start getting up over 0.5.
Right.
And then when you start getting under 0.5, now you can set a cutoff of, hey, if you're in the 0.3s, I don't want you going any heavier, if we're at whatever point in our calendar. If we're in the 0.2s, we certainly don't want to go heavier. Or you can graduate kids that way based on trust. Hey, you're only
Yeah.
allowed to lift, like you've only earned the right. That's the thing I've considered doing, is to say, you've earned the right to go lower in instances where I have particularly a lot of younger, newer kids.
Yeah.
Until at least that, and then when they've kind of reined it in to pay more attention, and they've earned a little more trust, then we can, let them loose more.
Right.
But yeah, the biggest thing is just it's another tool that helps me to instill an expectation of not just lifting the weight, but now an execution with it.
Yeah. So kind of my final question for you is, who are some coaches that you think maybe don't get enough love, or coaches that you go to for like information? Like, I guess kind of give me your rundown of like your 5 coaches that you think that people should need to be listening to or reading their stuff or things like that. Give me kind of a rundown, share some resources that, the people need to be listening to or watching.
Obviously, Louis, to read as much Louis stuff as you can. And the key with Louis, or really with anyone here, is you have to read, apply, and reread. Listen, apply, and re-listen. If you are lucky enough to have access to talk to any of these people, talk to them, explain what it is that's happening that you're seeing, and then readjust based on whatever the feedback is.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff is, a lot of stuff gets lost in terminology and semantics. A lot of, there are things that I do that you might think are incredibly helpful, and I don't think are interesting enough to say.
Right.
So I might harp on a point that's very obvious to you, and I skip over one that's very obvious to me.
Right.
And you end up confused or applying things in a wonky fashion because of, simple error in communication. So with that said, like Louis is extremely difficult to kind of understand from just how he spoke and writes. I don't like to recommend the Book of Methods to people so much as that gray special strengths book. I think that there's better explanations and better examples in that book. The newer kind of, if you're like brand new to Conjugate and you want to figure something out, to go to that newer, like it's like the Conjugate method, a further explanation,
Oh, yeah.
enhanced understanding or something. That is just a much better put together book than the Book of Methods. Like that had what looks like a real editor and was written sort of to be consumed in the same period of time, versus the Book of Methods is like, there are parts of it that are contradictory because it's really like an amalgamation of different articles that were written over,
Yeah.
15 years stretch.
Right.
So you go like, well, wait a second, this says this and this says that. And like, if you're like me and you have a stack of, powerlifting USAs, then you can go back to like 1983's articles and read, you're like, oh no, I remember when he was saying that. And yeah, now I remember that he's like, and it becomes almost like the Book of Methods is like a sort of like 101 type refresher. Um, all that is to say, it's not a really good, like, it's not a well written book.
Yeah.
But if you can understand Lewanese, then you can get a lot out of it. Then I get a lot of stuff from like Hoff, but it's stuff that like isn't really accessible unless you're like there with him. If you
Right.
train with him just even like once, just to see how he goes about his training, it's like training with like a Pro Bowl, perennial Pro Bowl like NFL receiver where you're like, oh wow, look at the detail that he runs his routes with, and like look at the intensity, like this is what it's supposed to be. Um, and then a lot of his sort of just like mental approach. But again, that's hard stuff to refer someone to too. Um, so from that standpoint, going Louis, Jared, listen to Jared's podcast, apply it, listen again. I've listened to episodes from Jared like 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
I listen
Shout
to
out to
every
Jared
episode from
Bidney,
Jared.
Explosive Mechanics Podcast. Is that what it's called? Explosive Strength Podcast. Go listen to that.
Yeah. So Jared, likewise, Brandon Bird Sports Performance. Bird is a more fluid kind of, I've had this conversation with you before, obviously, but I kind of put all these coaches on like a spectrum. And well, my cat wanted to say hi. So I put all these coaches on a spectrum, and there's like Jared on one end, who's very simplified and sort of, Louis would say like introverted. He's very introverted and sort of rigid in his structure. And then
Yep.
there's Bird on the other side, who's like very extroverted and sort of free flowing and amorphous with his structure.
Yeah.
And um, Bird is where I get a lot of the Max V stuff. It so happens that Jared is more the
Acceleration guy.
short acceleration, extreme strength. Bird is a little more, he's a lot more the max velocity and
Elasticity, things like that.
elasticity.
Yeah.
Just, I kind of hate to phrase it this way, but it's like science and art.
Yeah.
I don't believe in art. I'm a published author, published documentary filmmaker. I do not believe in art. Art is bullshit. Art is what the consumer calls something that they don't understand. So with that, it's more like improvisational science on one side and like,
Rigid, kind of.
structure.
Yeah.
But and in my head, I kind of slot that like Jared, who is another person that you kind of make a lot of Jared's ideas. Jared is a lot like Louis, where he's so far down his own rabbit hole, he kind of speaks his own language. You are similar, but you are very good at articulating a lot of those same thoughts. So you're almost like a gateway to Jared in terms of making the same kind of ideas and sentiments like very accessible to a much lower entry point. I think in a lot of ways, I've at different times sort of been like that with Louis and with Westside. I know when I was there, I like literally did that some days.
Yeah.
Where Louis would say something and then he'd go, "Yeah, you explain it," and he'd just walk away because he was frustrated. And then I would say, "What Louis is trying to say is this, and what you are trying to ask is this, and this is what those like. Here's how that merges." but so the three most sort of influential in terms of what other people can glean things from and take from and access would be Louis's work is sort of the foundation. And then Jared's work, especially towards the brief maximal tension and the dumbbell jumps. And then Bird, and he's a pretty accessible person, but also he's got a podcast that's
Yep.
I very much like. I've been on several times for long marathon episodes like this. And then you have been very influential on my training over the last over the last years, when I shuffled a lot of stuff up, sort of based on like conversations we had last summer. Then a coach that I'm like very interested in would be like Sammy
Seabach.
Seabach or Sabach.
Yep. The
Yeah.
Iron Saints. Yep.
Yeah. And it kind of, again, in looking at that spectrum, I'm always very curious of like,
He's like Bird. That's what when I
yeah,
talk to him, he's like Bird.
he's like Bird. Um, guys like him or Chantos or Brian Bott, a lot of
Yep.
these people exist very much on that spectrum.
Yeah.
And I'm always interested in looking at sort of what are the new ways that they apply things. Waffle Iron, Stephen Rose.
Yep.
He doesn't coach a lot of people, but he just
Super smart.
builds things.
Yeah.
Super smart, has great
I need to get him
questions.
on. I need to get him on.
Yeah, he has great questions. I don't think anyone's ever really had him on
I
anything.
know. That's why I feel like he's a gem that nobody's really seen yet. But like talking to
Yeah,
him, like I've told him, like I regard him as one of the smarter people that I talk to. Like realistically, like he knows so much, and he
yeah,
just doesn't put his stuff out there. But he's by far one of the smartest coaches that I've talked to. When he asks me questions, I'm like, this guy gets it. I can say it whatever way I want, and he just gets it.
yeah. But he asks a lot of really creative, really good questions that cause me to oftentimes like realize,
Yeah.
like, I feel like most people know most things, and that, again, like life causes you to take two things that you know and suddenly connect them.
Yeah.
And a lot of times for me, like one of my favorite things to do is when a coach calls me and says like, "Hey, I'm seeing this. What do you think about that?" And then it's almost like I'm house, and I'm asking, like, well, like, how tall is it? How tall is he? How long has he been training? How much does he weigh? Okay, what does he jump? Okay, does he kind of run like this or run like that? And I'm
Yeah.
trying to like play 21 questions basically as quick as I can, or almost like Wordle or something, like get to like
Yeah.
what's the diagnosis? And it's like my favorite thing to do. And when I can't figure one out, like I'll get really aggravated, but I'm so happy whenever I find someone who's like, yeah, I'm seeing this. What could be going on? And I say, like, let me guess. It's a guy who came in jumping 28 to 31 inches on the just jump mat. He's skinny. He's relatively lazy, and now he's frustrated because he hasn't PR'd in 2 weeks on the jump, but his squat is still going up. And they're like, yeah. I'm like, yeah, wait until day 1 of week 4. He'll hit a new PR. And then it happens, like just clockwork. And they go, what? How did you do that? Oh, his work capacity was crap, but he's naturally capable of relatively high outputs. So, like basically, from the end of workout one, he's in a state of fatigue that he's unable to get out of. So his CNS can't organize efficiently enough to display it within a jump, but he can hit new PRs in the squat every time. And eventually, about 21 days, he'll develop the work capacity. He'll come in, he'll think you're full of shit, he'll be ready to give up, and you'll inform him that he just broke his PR by a full inch on a warm-up. And then it happens. But yes, I like collecting little, like, almost like party tricks like that.
Yeah.
And then, like, weirdly enough, I know that I've said his name several times, but like, especially for argumentative purposes, like a lot of Tony Holler's language.
Yeah.
Um, and then I'm always, I'm constantly finding new coaches that, not even really new coaches, but just coaches who are like trendy, who seem to disagree with me on a lot. And I'll like obsess and sort of deep dive into what they do and try and like, a lot of times I think people have something that's successful that they don't understand why it's successful. And so I try and again reconcile like the math of like, okay, what's going on here? Because he's saying
Yeah.
that it works this way, and I know it doesn't work that way. And he's saying the way that I do it can't work. And I know that
Right.
it does work when I do it. So what is he doing? Like, what is his offset that
Right.
allows him not to do the thing that I do that is similar to something else that I do? So, we'll see a guy who, Jared does the really deep box squats, and I'll see somebody else do higher box squats. And they'll go like, okay, well, they're getting the results that are similar, like, to Jared in function. So what are they doing differently? And you'll find out like, oh, they do a lot of like, uh, barbell lunges, heavy
Goblet
barbell
squats, front
lunges.
squats, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, what they miss from a portion of Jared's squat, they
Making
get
up
somewhere
for it.
else.
Yeah.
Or often, like they'll say, well, we do, or they're a wide stance box squatter,
Yeah.
right? And you go like, okay, so where are you offsetting that, like somewhere else? And what else are you doing wide stance? Are you doing anything else wide stance? Are you, I'll talk to a lot of people who they try and mix and blend programs, and they'll be like, well, we're squatting this like just like what Jared says, so why aren't we running this? And again, you get into like, are you doing everything else the way that Jared says?
Right.
And now, don't compare yourself to Jared now with kids who've been doing this for 10 years, like cycling over and over again, raising the bar for each successive generation. Which also kind of goes back to the Matt Reyes stuff. Like, you can't, you always have to account for all of you have to account for the athletes being older. You have to account
Right.
for the athletes coming from a more successful system. You have to account the athletes coming from a different geography. You have to account for the athletes being trained for multiple years in a different system.
Right.
And then you have to account for the cultural like expectations. I heard somebody on a podcast, it was a football recruiting podcast, and they said it was just like a snippet on Twitter, and they said, like, we always look for kids who are a good athlete from a great program. And then they said, like, we look at like Kimberly High School. You might be the fourth best player in your class at Kimberly High School in Wisconsin, and other schools will walk by you because you're 5'11". But we
Right.
know you're worth just as much as a 6'2" guy because you come from such a strong institution of winning.
Right.
Um, and it's little things like that where, like, you could be just another dude at Explosive Mechanics, and that probably means you would be the dude anywhere else.
Anywhere else. Yeah.
but yet at the same time, you never would develop into that dude anywhere else.
Right.
You know, um, so yeah, I think it's at Chantos. I don't know. There's other people I've admired, like again, doing one of those deep dives, like um, the knees over toes guy, Ben Patrick. I don't agree with like wide swaths of what he does and stuff, or I don't think that it's like inherently special. But then I go like, oh, the way that he really emphasizes things like sled drags and things like Nordics. And you see again where I go like, oh, I see these offsets that are similar to components of my pro. Like I see what he's doing, and you know, just to the way he talks about like organizing his weight room and stuff. I'm like, those are interesting
Right.
ideas. Um, Trying to think. Villani, the last time when I met him down in South Florida, um, about probably a month ago, and I don't categorize it within um I don't categorize it within my head a lot in terms of looking at straight programming. But again, he has a systemized way of like teaching cuts,
Right.
which I don't, know super well. But again, I look at it and go like, oh, that's similar to what I do with this.
Yeah.
And oh, he's taken this thing that I like just touch upon, he's taken and expanded out a full sort of, but to me, that's more like it's much more like cognitive.
Right.
Like he's bridging the understanding of the athlete, and that's why this thing that he talks about works.
Right.
One guy who I'm really interested in that I've taken a little bit of stuff from, particularly a couple exercises that he talked with, I think, to Bird about on Bird's podcast. Um, Coach Branchow up in
Michigan.
Michigan. Yeah. Um, I'm really fascinated because he has some phenomenal results. And again, you can see like a really heavy conjugate influence, but I've never talked to him specifically about how he's mixing any of that together.
Yeah.
But a thing like I was doing lots of TKEs and stuff with my athletes, just single leg banded TKEs, and then listening to him talk about what he called, quad pumps. Um, and basically doing it with both legs at the same time. And I tried it that way and was like, oh, this feels a lot better.
Yeah.
Like very simple switch and feels very nice, even on my
Yeah.
37-year-old knees.
Yeah.
And to that point, like Donnie Thompson, you talk about a top five, Donnie would definitely be within my top five.
Yeah.
Um, we do so much. We do body tempering, you know, Dick Hartzell adaptations that basically were things that I saw Donnie do either in person or on video. Um, but yeah, I use Donnie stuff every day with tons of kids, so have
Yeah.
to be done. And again, even with Donnie, the idea that like Donnie was a relatively average lifter in say like 2000, and then he was the best in the world 2011.
Right. That
Like
longevity, him being able
the
to slowly
well,
climb and do it the right way.
yeah, just the idea that and like I'm friends with say Anthony Oliveira, and I look at him the same way. Like when
Yeah.
we see all these conversations about like genetics and genetic limitations and things on Twitter. Um, when you look at somebody like Anthony, who was, homeless in his 20s with addiction issues and, like 140 pounds, and now he's one of the top lifters in the world, a little over a decade later, basically went in 5 years, went from homeless, like a homeless addict to a WPO level lifter
Right.
in like 5, 6 years. A body that was beaten up from junior league hockey, a guy who was just another dude in the amateur hockey circuit, who becomes one of the, elite athletes at his craft in the entire world, and has this huge sort of upsetting, very physical thing happen to him.
Yeah.
And you go like, he never was a genetic specimen. So now how does he lift like one? And
Right.
how does he lift like one having taken this big detour in the middle of his life? And again, that goes back to expectations and that idea of like, if I say I'm near the end, then I'm at the end.
Right.
If I say the end is nowhere near, like if I say like, just I keep treating every number like it's just a number, then how far can I go? And to look at Donnie the same way and go like, to lift those sums at that age, to be 46 and lift a weight no one has ever lifted, and not have been Gary Frank, and not have been Anthony Clark, and not have been Matt Dimmel, and not have been Kurt Karwowski or Ed Cohn, to be like a dude, just
Yeah.
an average kind of dude
Right.
who really likes the shit,
Right.
and slowly mold yourself for that long. You start thinking about like the on ramp that we give athletes to like make it to the top of their game. Like it's really a shame that there's not like more developmental leagues where people could continue, especially for a thing like football or something, to continue working on their craft, because it's like, you take a kind of smart kid with great work ethic and, a OCD or autism or something, and you just give them the time and the space to continue developing. And it's like, what if you caught that same person who almost can get a scholarship at 18? What if we just saw how far they would develop by like 26?
Yeah.
They might be one of the best people in the world,
Right.
if they're just given sound guidance.
Right. All right. Well, I think it's going to wrap us up. It's 5 o'clock, so we went
Yeah.
right to the end of that. So to close a bit, thank you again, Michael, for taking, I don't know, 5 hours, whatever, out of your schedule today to sit down and talk all things training, coaching. We're probably gonna have to do another one of these to talk more about like coaching methods and things like that. Um, Thank you to all the listeners and everyone it's kind of shouted out the podcast or reached out about it. I know you really enjoyed the first episode with Jared, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy this one a lot. We're going to drop this in a couple weeks per Michael, giving out some top secret information on some of his stuff at OVR. But thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or you need anything, you can reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram, as well as Michael. I'll put Michael's Twitter and Instagram on the description. But thank you so much for listening.